My son-in-law mocked me after knocking my plate down while making a toast at dinner in front of his senior colleagues and partners. "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor," he whispered. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and said 3 words that left him completely terrified. The next day, I did something even worse. My name is Eldon Wright. I am 69 years old, and somehow I am still fixing the mistakes of a family that views me as a burden. To the outside world, I am just a retired postal worker living on a modest pension. I wear faded suits, drive an old sedan, and keep my head down. But beneath that simple facade, I secretly control the Vanguard Trust, a massive investment fund that practically built the tech empire my arrogant son-in-law currently stands upon. Before I dive into this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone of your true worth. The private dining room at the high-end steakhouse buzzed with the sound of clinking crystal and arrogant laughter. Blake, my white son-in-law, was celebrating a massive funding round for his new technology startup. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table wearing the same faded gray suit I wore to my late wife Nadine's funeral 10 years ago. I kept this old suit because it reminded me of the days when Nadine and I had nothing but our sheer willpower. Monique, my daughter, had insisted I come to show family support, but she spent the entire evening avoiding my gaze. She was clearly embarrassed by my presence among Blake's wealthy venture capitalist friends. They discussed yachts and offshore accounts while I sat quietly eating my meal. Blake stood up at the head of the table, raising his glass of expensive champagne to command the room's attention. He began pacing around the table, boasting endlessly about his genius and his visionary leadership in the tech industry. When he reached my chair, he deliberately bumped his elbow hard against my shoulder. My plate of roasted steak flipped into the air and crashed onto the polished marble floor. Meat and heavy gravy splattered across my worn leather shoes. The room went dead silent. Blake leaned down, pressing his face close to my ear. His breath smelled of vintage alcohol and pure malice. He whispered a command meant only for me. He told me that if I wanted dinner, I should lick it off the floor. The wealthy partners and senior colleagues stared at me, waiting eagerly for the old black man to cause a scene. They expected me to yell, to curse, to embarrass my daughter and ruin their pristine corporate evening. I did none of those things. Nadine always taught me that true power never needs to raise its voice. Anger is a luxury reserved for those who lack real control. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor, cutting through the heavy silence. I stood up to my full height, towering slightly over Blake's slouched posture. I reached down and calmly buttoned my faded gray jacket, smoothing out the cheap fabric with deliberate, steady hands. I looked directly into Blake's pale blue eyes. He kept a smug, challenging smirk plastered across his face, entirely confident in his superiority and my supposed helplessness. He genuinely believed I was just a broke pensioner surviving on a tiny government check and his eventual charity. I held his intense gaze until his smile finally flickered, a tiny crack forming in his arrogant armor. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in a low, perfectly steady tone that carried across the quiet dining room. I told him his funding was pulled. Blake let out a sharp, forced laugh that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. He turned quickly to his wealthy investors, spreading his arms wide to dismiss the awkward tension hovering in the air. He told the room not to mind Eldon, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. He claimed the poor guy gets a little confused these days, suggesting my age was finally catching up to my mind. The investors chuckled politely, shaking their heads and returning to their expensive drinks, assuming I was just a senile old relative. Monique looked down at her lap, her hands tightly gripping her silk napkin. She refused to defend me. She remained completely silent, allowing her husband to humiliate her father in public just to keep the peace. I did not offer another word. I turned my back on the glittering chandelier and the table full of greedy executives. I walked straight out the heavy oak doors of the restaurant and into the freezing cold night air. A valet hailed a taxi for me immediately. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver my address. I leaned back against the worn leather cushion, feeling a deep, chilling clarity settling over my mind. My silence in that dining room was not submission or defeat. It was the absolute beginning of a total and ruthless reckoning. The bright city lights blurred past the taxi window as we drove away from the bustling downtown district. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently inside my coat pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a text message from Monique apologizing for her husband's terrible behavior at dinner. Instead, an urgent security alert from the central banking system flashed across my screen. Years ago, as the hidden chairman of the Vanguard Trust, I had established a silent monitoring protocol on Monique's financial accounts to ensure her safety. I built my fortune from nothing, and I was determined to protect my only child from financial predators. The glowing notification read clearly: an unauthorized wire transfer of $50,000 was just initiated from Monique's personal joint savings account. The destination was an untraceable external routing number in a foreign jurisdiction. Blake did not just mock me at dinner to stroke his own ego. He possessed enough cunning to realize the severe threat hidden within my three simple words. He knew I held the financial strings to his company's survival, and his sudden panic was driving him to act recklessly. Rather than face the consequences of his failing business, he was actively draining his own wife's life savings while she sat obliviously at his table drinking champagne. He was bleeding my daughter dry before the news of his ruined empire hit the morning papers. The cold blue light of my phone screen illuminated the back seat of the taxi, $50,000 vanishing into the ether. Blake thought he could pillage my daughter's future while celebrating his own fake success. He severely underestimated the man he just humiliated. I dialed a private number I had kept on speed dial for decades. Jonathan answered on the second ring. He was my wealth manager, the chief legal architect of the Vanguard Trust, and a man who understood the power of swift execution. I did not offer any pleasantries. I told Jonathan to initiate an absolute freeze on every Vanguard credit line attached to Blake's tech startup. I also ordered an immediate lock on the marital accounts tied to our corporate guarantee. Jonathan asked no questions. I heard the rapid clatter of his keyboard through the receiver. He possessed full authorization to terminate capital flow without board approval. 35 years of building a financial empire from the ground up gave me that absolute authority. In less than 2 minutes, the digital lifeline keeping Blake's fragile business afloat was severed completely. The startup he paraded around the steakhouse was nothing but a hollow shell running on Vanguard money. Without my silent backing, his entire corporate structure was a house of cards. I hung up the phone and watched the city lights blur past the window. My father taught me that a cornered rat will bite, but a starved rat will eat itself. Blake wanted to play a game of dominance. I just dismantled his playing board. Tomorrow morning, the reality of his arrogance would crash down upon his head. I paid the driver in cash and stepped into the quiet night fully prepared for the war I just started. The sun rose over the financial district the next morning. Blake sat at a corner table inside an exclusive rooftop bistro overlooking the skyline. He was treating his 3 senior partners to a lavish breakfast of imported caviar and truffles, solidifying the illusion of his triumphant funding round. He laughed loudly, dominating the conversation, completely unaware that his financial oxygen had been shut off hours ago. When the silver tray carrying the exorbitant bill arrived, Blake casually tossed his heavy black corporate card onto it without looking. He continued boasting about his upcoming expansion plans. 10 minutes passed. The restaurant manager approached the table flanked by a burly security guard. The lively chatter among the partners died instantly. The manager did not smile. He placed a pair of heavy scissors on the crisp white tablecloth. He then produced Blake's black corporate card and deliberately snipped it cleanly in half. The sharp crack of this plastic snapping echoed across the dining room. The manager informed Blake in a loud, clear voice that his banking institution had permanently revoked his credit lines due to catastrophic default. He demanded an alternative form of payment immediately. Blake's face drained of color. He scrambled to pull out his personal credit cards, hands shaking wildly, but every single card was declined. The Vanguard freeze encompassed all collateral accounts. His partners watched in absolute disgust. They realized immediately that the genius CEO was a fraud swimming in frozen debt. One of the partners tossed a $100 bill onto the table to cover his own coffee and walked out in silence. The rest followed, leaving Blake abandoned, humiliated, and staring at the severed pieces of his fake wealth. His empire collapsed before he even finished his morning coffee. I sat in my worn armchair reading the morning newspaper when the heavy thud of footsteps pounded up my front porch. The wooden front door exploded inward, the deadbolt splintering against the doorframe. Blake stormed into my living room like a rabid animal. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie yanked loose, and his chest heaved with frantic breaths. The mask of the sophisticated tech genius was completely gone, replaced by the manic desperation of a ruined man. I did not flinch. I carefully folded my newspaper and placed it on the side table. Blake marched across the rug and violently slammed a thick stack of papers onto my coffee table. The bold heading at the top read, "Psychiatric Evaluation and Competency Report." It was stamped with the seal of a private clinic I had never visited in my entire life. Blake stood over me, veins bulging in his neck. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He declared that I was legally insane. He shouted that my mind was deteriorating, that I was a danger to society, and that he possessed the medical proof to strip away my basic human rights. He had paid a corrupt doctor to falsify a medical diagnosis of severe dementia. His plan was brutally simple. He intended to erase my legal autonomy to seize control of the trust he assumed I possessed. He viewed me not as a father-in-law, but as a senile obstacle standing between him and his survival. I looked down at the forged document. The ink was barely dry. He had orchestrated this medical fraud long before the dinner party. He was always planning to lock me away and steal whatever scraps he thought an old postal worker had left. Blake kicked the coffee table, sending the forged medical report sliding toward my feet. He screamed that he would drag me out of my own house in a straitjacket. He promised to lock me in a state-run asylum where the nurses would drug me into oblivion. He leaned down, his face flushed with panic and rage, demanding I sign a complete transfer of power of attorney. He specifically ordered me to sign over the deed to my house so he could liquidate it instantly to save his sinking company. I stared at him with cold detachment. I told him he broke my front door for nothing. Before Blake could unleash another violent threat, a shadow shifted in the doorway. Monique stepped into the living room. My daughter looked exhausted, her eyes swollen and red from crying all night. She stood directly behind her husband, her arms wrapped defensively around her own stomach. The sight of her standing beside the man who secretly stole $50,000 from her savings tore a hole in my heart. She did not look at me with love or respect. She looked at me with deep, misdirected pity. Monique begged me to stop fighting. She cried out that my mind was failing and that I was destroying Blake's hard work out of pure spite. She pleaded with me to sign the papers so they could take care of me in a facility. She had completely bought into his vicious lie. My own daughter was standing in my living room, actively helping the man who robbed her orchestrate my total destruction. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding right in front of my eyes. The war was no longer just about Blake. I had to save my daughter from her own delusion. Monique stepped around her husband and approached the coffee table. Her designer dress was wrinkled and her hands shook violently. She pointed at the forged psychiatric evaluation. She told me to look at the paper and accept reality. She echoed every single lie Blake had planted in her head over the past few weeks. She claimed my memory was failing and my sudden hostility toward her husband was a symptom of a diseased mind. She actually accused me of sabotaging Blake out of bitter jealousy over his massive success in the tech world. I looked at the daughter I raised with everything I had. I saw a terrified woman parroting the exact script of a financial predator. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity or my actions. I kept my hands resting calmly on the arms of my chair. I told Monique to look at the man she married. I reminded her of the exact words her mother Nadine spoke on her deathbed. Nadine told her to never let a man define her absolute worth and to never trade her hard-earned dignity for the cheap illusion of security. Monique flinched hard as if I had physically struck her. The mention of her mother pierced right through the heavy manipulation Blake had carefully woven around her. She glanced back at him, a sudden flash of doubt crossing her tear-stained face. Blake saw his absolute control slipping away in real time. He realized my words were breaking his psychological hold over my daughter. He stepped forward, quickly putting himself physically between Monique and me. He snatched the forged property transfer document from the table and shoved it aggressively toward my chest. He demanded I stop manipulating my daughter with emotional garbage and sign the deed to the house immediately. Blake pulled a heavy silver pen from his tailored jacket pocket and thrust it violently toward my right hand. He leaned his entire body weight over the coffee table, attempting to physically intimidate a man he genuinely believed was frail and senile. He ordered me to sign the property transfer right this second. He threatened to call the police and have me dragged out of my own home in handcuffs if I refused to comply with his demands. He made the fatal mistake of grabbing my wrist to force the pen into my palm. My days of sorting heavy mail crates gave me a grip like iron, but 35 years of ruthless corporate survival gave me perfect lethal reflexes. I dropped my newspaper, caught his wrist mid-air, and twisted it sharply backward with calculated force. The loud pop of his joint echoed clearly in the quiet living room. Blake let out a high-pitched shriek and dropped the expensive pen onto the rug. He stumbled backward, clutching his injured arm against his chest, his face completely drained of color. He stared at me with pure, unadulterated terror, finally realizing the old black man sitting in the armchair was not a helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered. I stood up smoothly and kicked the silver pen across the room. I told Blake to get out of my house before I broke his arm completely. Blake did not say another word. He grabbed Monique by the elbow, practically dragging her out the front door. He shoved her into his leased car and sped away down the street, leaving the shattered pieces of my front door scattered across the porch. The physical threat was over, but the real war for my daughter's survival had just escalated. I stepped over the broken door frame and walked straight to my secure home office. The false psychiatric report remained on the coffee table, a clear indicator of Blake's extreme desperation. He needed liquid cash immediately to replace the Vanguard trust funds I had frozen the night before. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Jonathan. He answered instantly on the first ring. I skipped the details of the home invasion and issued a direct, uncompromising command. I ordered him to run a comprehensive forensic audit on Monique's personal credit history. I needed to know exactly how much damage Blake had inflicted on her finances behind closed doors. Jonathan warned me that accessing her personal credit files without direct authorization violated strict federal privacy protocols. I reminded him that I built the Vanguard Trust from nothing to protect my bloodline, and I authorized the security breach personally. I instructed him to look for hidden credit lines, secret loans, and any unapproved collateral tied to her name. Blake was a cornered animal, and a man willing to forge medical documents to steal a house would absolutely forge his wife's signature to save his fragile ego. I hung up the phone and waited in the silent house. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floorboards. I thought about the $50,000 Blake had stolen from their joint account just hours ago. That theft was merely a symptom of a much larger, more destructive disease. I needed the full diagnosis before I could execute the next phase of my retaliation. My computer chimed loudly with an incoming encrypted email from Jonathan. I opened the encrypted attachment from Jonathan. The financial report loaded onto my screen, and the sheer scale of the betrayal made my blood run cold. Blake had not just drained their joint savings account, he had actively weaponized Monique's perfect credit score to fund his failing tech startup. The audit revealed 3 maxed-out corporate credit cards opened entirely in her name without her knowledge. But the final page of the document held the true death blow. 6 months ago, Blake had forged Monique's signature to take out a massive second mortgage on their marital home. He had funneled the entire lump sum directly into his corporate accounts to cover payroll and mask his utter incompetence from his wealthy investors. He had not made a single repayment on that illegal loan. A bright red notice flashed at the bottom of the legal summary. The bank had officially initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings against the property. The final eviction notice was scheduled to be served by the end of this current week. Monique was completely unaware that she was days away from being thrown onto the street by the bank. Blake was desperate to steal my suburban home today because he had already lost his own. He was fully willing to let his wife take the fall for his massive financial fraud while he scrambled for a secure lifeboat. I closed the laptop and grabbed my heavy winter coat. Blake thought he could outsmart me by attacking my daughter's financial future. I was going to strip away the very last thing he valued in this world. Blake grabbed his keys and rushed out of the house. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his silver Porsche 911, peeling away from the curb and speeding toward downtown. He was scheduled for an emergency lunch meeting with a rival venture capitalist, a man known for swooping in to acquire desperate startups at a fraction of their worth. Blake needed immediate cash flow to stop his entire operation from imploding before the weekend. He believed that his aggressive charm and the perceived status of his luxury sports car would convince the investor that his company was still thriving. The lease on that exact vehicle, however, was guaranteed solely by the massive corporate accounts held by the Vanguard Trust. I watched his car disappear around the corner from my living room window. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Jonathan's direct line once more. The connection was instantaneous. I ordered Jonathan to completely sever the financial guarantee on the Porsche lease and to instruct the dealership to execute an immediate repossession order. I told him to authorize whatever premium was necessary to ensure the tow truck arrived at Blake's exact location within the hour. Blake parked his car in the VIP spot directly outside the towering glass windows of the venture capital firm. He adjusted his silk tie in the rearview mirror, grabbed his alligator skin briefcase, and confidently strode into the lobby. He assumed he had successfully escaped the disaster of the morning. He had no idea his entire financial safety net had already been dismantled while he was sitting in traffic. Blake sat in the private dining room on the ground floor, separated from the street only by massive floor-to-ceiling windows. He was midway through delivering a fabricated pitch about his company's unstoppable upward trajectory when a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck reversed aggressively into the VIP parking zone. The piercing beep of the truck's backup alarm cut right through the expensive classical music playing inside the restaurant. Blake and the venture capitalist paused their conversation and looked out the window. A man in a high-visibility vest hopped out of the truck and swiftly attached thick metal chains to the front axle of the gleaming silver Porsche. Blake leaped up from the table, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He abandoned his potential investor and sprinted out the front doors of the restaurant, shouting wildly at the tow truck driver to stop. He waved his keys in the air, demanding the man unhook his vehicle immediately. He screamed that it was a massive mistake and threatened to sue the entire towing company into bankruptcy. The driver ignored his threats completely. He pulled a folded legal document from his clipboard and shoved it directly into Blake's chest. The document stated that the lease guarantor had formally withdrawn all financial backing, plunging the vehicle into immediate, irrevocable default. Blake stared at the paper in absolute shock. The venture capitalist watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold clearly from his table behind the glass. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out the back exit without saying a single word to Blake. The tow truck driver unceremoniously tossed a heavy black garbage bag onto the sidewalk. The bag contained Blake's gym clothes, a spare pair of shoes, and some loose papers from the trunk. The hydraulic winch screamed as it hauled the luxury sports car onto the flatbed. Blake stood completely frozen on the concrete, clutching the cheap plastic bag to his chest as the truck roared away down the busy avenue. He was stranded miles away from his office, stripped of his transportation, and completely humiliated in front of his last viable financial lifeline. He tried to hail a taxi, but his phone buzzed with an alert. All his rideshare applications were tied to the corporate cards Jonathan had canceled that morning. He possessed zero cash. Blake was forced to walk 30 blocks through the sweltering downtown heat carrying a garbage bag while wearing a wool suit that cost $5,000. Sweat poured down his face, ruining his perfectly styled hair and staining his expensive collar. Every step forced him to confront the terrifying reality of his situation. The severed credit cards, the sudden foreclosure notice, the immediate repossession of his car. These were not random banking errors. He finally realized the immense, crushing truth. The quiet, faded man he mocked at dinner possessed the absolute power to dismantle his entire existence with a single phone call. Eldon Wright was not a fragile target waiting to be victimized. He was the invisible architect of Blake's entire reality. Blake finally reached his company headquarters, his suit drenched in sweat and his face flushed with uncontrollable rage. He stormed through the glass doors of his office building, ignoring the startled looks of his receptionist. He needed a target to absorb the massive humiliation he had just endured. He barged directly into the engineering department and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He fired 3 of his most senior software developers, all African-American men, who had built the original code for his startup. He cited fabricated performance issues and ordered security to escort them out of the building immediately. The sudden, vicious termination was purely an act of desperate retaliation against a world he could no longer control. He slammed the door to his private office and locked it. He paced the floor like a caged animal picking up his desk phone. If he could not touch my money, he would destroy my autonomy. He dialed the direct emergency line for Adult Protective Services. He adopted a panicked, tearful voice and filed a formal expedited report against me. He falsely claimed that I was suffering from severe violent dementia hallucinations. He stated that I had physically assaulted him that morning with a weapon, and that I was an immediate danger to myself and my daughter. He provided my exact address and demanded an emergency psychological intervention to have me forcibly removed from my home. The state agency promised to dispatch a response team immediately. Blake hung up the phone with a sick smile. He had just initiated a hostile state intervention against my freedom. The flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers washed across my front lawn, casting harsh shadows through the living room curtains. An unmarked gray sedan pulled up directly behind them. Blake had wasted absolutely no time executing his threat. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They were flanked by 2 social workers from Adult Protective Services carrying thick manila folders. They marched up my driveway, fully expecting to confront a violent, deteriorating old man who had supposedly assaulted his son-in-law. They approached my splintered front door, their faces tight with professional apprehension. I did not make them wait or force them to knock. I pulled the door open myself and stood tall in the entryway. I wore a fresh, perfectly pressed suit. The lead social worker, a stern woman with a tightly wound bun, took a hesitant step forward. She announced her name and stated they were responding to an emergency psychiatric distress call. She informed me that a family member had provided sworn testimony claiming I was suffering from severe aggressive dementia and that I posed an immediate lethal threat to myself and the surrounding public. The police officers flanked her, instructing me to step outside slowly and keep my hands completely visible. They explained they had a state-mandated order to transport me to a secure facility for a mandatory 72-hour psychological hold. Blake intended to rip me from my home and lock me in a clinical cage while he systematically dismantled my daughter's life. He weaponized the state to do his dirty work. I looked at the officers and the social workers. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply stepped back and invited them inside. The social workers and police officers stepped into my living room, their eyes scanning the space for any sign of chaos or squalor. They found only immaculate order, perfectly arranged furniture, and shelves lined with classic literature. I gestured for them to sit at my polished dining table. The lead social worker unclasped her folder, preparing to recite Blake's fabricated list of my supposed mental failures. I preempted her entirely. I reached into my desk drawer and retrieved a locked leather portfolio. I placed it onto the center of the table and opened it. I slid a heavy embossed document directly toward the social workers. It was a comprehensive, flawless psychiatric evaluation and cognitive clearance. It was signed and certified less than 30 days ago by Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief neurologist at the state's most prestigious medical research hospital. The evaluation explicitly stated my cognitive functions were exceptionally sharp and functioning in the highest possible percentile. The social worker read the conclusion, her rigid posture suddenly faltering. Before she could process the medical clearance, I slid a second stack of documents across the wood. I presented my verified corporate tax returns and the executive summary of the Vanguard Trust. I watched the color drain completely from her face as she read the bottom line. The documents proved beyond any doubt that the quiet man sitting in front of her generated tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. I calmly explained that her concerned informant was actually a fraudulent bankrupt CEO attempting to seize my assets by abusing the adult protective system. The officers leaned in to inspect the financial summaries. The entire narrative Blake had carefully constructed to strip away my freedom disintegrated instantly under the crushing weight of absolute undeniable truth. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense authority to profound embarrassment. The lead social worker closed her manila folder and pushed it aside, her face flushing with deep anger. She realized immediately that she and her agency had been used as pawns in a malicious corporate theft. She looked at me and offered a sincere, deeply apologetic retraction. She explained the severe legal consequences of weaponizing adult protective services against a perfectly healthy citizen. The police officers visibly relaxed, pulling their hands away from their belts and shaking their heads in disgust. They recognized a blatant shakedown when they saw one. The social worker pulled a fresh incident report from her bag. She clicked her pen and asked me if I wished to press formal charges. I told her I absolutely did. She began drafting a counter-report classifying Blake's emergency call as a malicious false police report and a direct act of premeditated elder abuse. Filing a fake psychological distress warrant carried mandatory jail time. The officers took down Blake's full name, his company address, and the details of his leased vehicle. They informed me a judge would issue an arrest warrant for criminal harassment and filing a false police report by the end of the day. The trap Blake had viciously set to lock me in an asylum had now become a steel cage snapping shut around his own ankles. He thought he could outsmart me by hiding behind state authority. Instead, he handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to ensure he would soon be wearing a prison jumpsuit. The social workers stood up to leave, promising to fast-track the criminal referral. I escorted them to the door, perfectly satisfied that Blake's latest attack had been neutralized. Just as the police cruisers pulled away from my curb, the private landline in my home office rang with a sharp, insistent tone. It was not a number I recognized. I answered the call and heard the frantic, breathless voice of the director from Oakwood Manor, the highly exclusive assisted living facility where my late wife's elderly sister resided. Nadine's sister suffered from severe mobility issues and required round-the-clock medical supervision. The director apologized profusely but stated she was calling regarding an immediate administrative crisis. She informed me that less than an hour ago, someone used a secondary financial access terminal to permanently cancel the automated care payments covering my sister-in-law's residency. Blake had managed to execute one final spiteful financial command before Jonathan completely locked him out of the Vanguard infrastructure. The director explained that the facility's corporate policy was ruthless regarding missed payments. Because the corporate wire had bounced and the account was flagged as terminated, my aunt's residency status was instantly revoked. The director warned me that medical transport was currently preparing to move my sister-in-law to a state-run low-income overflow clinic by the end of the afternoon. Blake knew he could not touch my primary funds, so he deliberately targeted a helpless 80-year-old woman just to inflict maximum emotional pain on my family. He was throwing Nadine's sister out onto the street to punish me for his own failures. A cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. The war was no longer just about protecting my daughter's finances or my own dignity. Blake had crossed a line from which there would be no return. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. I pulled my sedan into the circular driveway of Oakwood Manor just as two medical transport workers wheeled a gurney toward the front sliding doors. The facility director stood in the lobby, her arms crossed tightly, watching my late wife Nadine's sister sit bewildered in a wheelchair, holding a single vinyl garbage bag of her belongings. I did not waste time with introductions. I parked the car illegally on the curb, strode past the transport workers, and instructed the director to cancel the transfer immediately. She stammered, holding up her clipboard trying to explain the corporate policy regarding terminated wire transfers and strict eviction mandates. I completely ignored her bureaucratic excuses. I opened my leather briefcase right there on the polished reception desk and pulled out a heavy stack of certified cashier checks I had secured on the drive over. I placed them firmly onto the marble counter. I told the director she was looking at $500,000, enough to cover the absolute highest tier of specialized medical care for the next 5 years paid entirely in advance. Her eyes widened as she quickly verified the authentic watermarks on the financial drafts. The aggressive corporate protocol that Blake relied upon to throw an 80-year-old woman onto the street was instantly vaporized by cold, hard capital. The director hastily apologized, ordering the transport team to return my sister-in-law to her private suite. I walked over to the wheelchair, gently took my aunt's trembling hand, and promised her she would never face the threat of eviction again. Blake wanted to weaponize financial panic to break my spirit. He only succeeded in proving exactly how far he was willing to go, removing any lingering hesitation I had about destroying him completely. Leaving the nursing home secured, I drove directly to a private soundproofed conference room located in the basement of a downtown architectural firm entirely owned by the Vanguard Trust. Jonathan was already there, his dual monitors illuminating the dark room with cascading rows of financial data. We needed to track the exact path of the $50,000 Blake had stolen from Monique's joint savings account the previous night. I poured a glass of black coffee and stood behind Jonathan's chair. Blake assumed he could hide his digital fingerprints by acting quickly while his company was imploding. He severely underestimated Vanguard's forensic accounting capabilities. Jonathan isolated the wire transfer within minutes. He showed me the initial routing numbers. The stolen money did not flow into the payroll accounts of Blake's failing technology startup. Instead, the $50,000 was instantly fragmented into 5 smaller transactions of $10,000 each. These fragments bypassed the domestic banking system entirely. They bounced through 3 separate anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. Blake had established a sophisticated automated money laundering pipeline long before his funding dried up. He was not making panic-driven mistakes to save his business. He was executing a carefully premeditated exit strategy. Jonathan bypassed the domestic privacy firewalls, pulling the incorporation documents for the shell companies. Every single entity listed Blake as the sole beneficiary, hidden behind layers of aggressive corporate anonymity. My son-in-law was deliberately starving his own company, letting his employees take the fall while simultaneously robbing his wife blind. The sheer scale of his deception required meticulous planning. I instructed Jonathan to follow the fragmented money trail to its final destination. I needed to see exactly where Blake was hoarding his stolen wealth before he attempted to flee the country entirely. Jonathan's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, dismantling the digital barricades Blake had paid thousands of dollars to construct. The fragmented financial trail left the United States completely. The funds merged back together in a highly secure private banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. Jonathan accessed the international ledger, bypassing the final layer of encryption. The balance of the offshore account loaded onto the screen, and the final number was staggering. Blake was currently holding over $4 million in untraceable liquid assets. Jonathan cross-referenced the deposit history with the financial records of Blake's technology startup and Monique's personal savings accounts. The brutal timeline of his fraud became undeniably clear. For the past 24 months, Blake had been systematically siphoning venture capital investments directly into this offshore slush fund. Every time he claimed his startup was struggling to meet development goals, he was secretly funneling investor cash across international borders. Even worse, the audit proved he had been slowly draining Monique's generational wealth. The phantom investments, he convinced her to authorize the emergency loans he claimed he needed to cover sudden corporate taxes. Every single cent she handed him, out of love and trust, went straight into this hidden Caribbean account. He had engineered a dual parasitism, bleeding his professional partners and his devoted wife simultaneously. Blake played the role of the stressed, overworked visionary returning home to complain about market pressures just to manipulate Monique into unlocking her Vanguard guaranteed funds. He had built his entire fortune on her stolen trust. He was preparing to file for bankruptcy domestically, leaving Monique completely ruined by the second mortgage while he sat comfortably on a mountain of stolen cash. He thought he was untouchable. I told Jonathan to dig deeper into the offshore account's outbound ledger. Blake was greedy, but he was also fundamentally arrogant. Arrogance always leaves a vulnerable paper trail. I ordered Jonathan to isolate every outbound transaction originating from the Cayman Islands account over the last 6 months. If Blake was hoarding millions offshore, he was undoubtedly funneling a portion of it back into the city to fund a secret lifestyle. Jonathan filtered the international wire transfers against local municipal property records. A recurring monthly payment of $12,000 immediately flagged the system. The money was wired directly from the offshore slush fund to a premier luxury real estate management firm located in the most exclusive zip code of the downtown district. Jonathan bypassed the property management firewall and pulled the original lease agreement. Blake was not using the stolen money to pay off his company's aggressive creditors. He was using the stolen funds to maintain a breathtaking 3-bedroom penthouse suite overlooking the river. I stared at the signature on the bottom of the digital lease contract. The apartment was not registered in Blake's name to avoid domestic tax scrutiny. It was registered entirely to a 25-year-old woman named Chloe. She was the exact same woman Blake employed as his personal executive secretary. While Monique was sitting at home agonizing over their forged second mortgage and defending her husband's failing business, Blake was financing a spectacular double life for his mistress using Monique's own stolen inheritance. He had constructed an elaborate financial fortress to protect his infidelity. I leaned over Jonathan's shoulder and memorized the address of the luxury high-rise building. Blake believed his fortress was impenetrable. He was about to learn that the Vanguard Trust owned the very ground his penthouse was built upon. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the city center. I parked my old sedan a block away from the towering glass facade of the Azure building. This was the most exclusive residential high-rise in the downtown district, a place where professional athletes and foreign dignitaries hid their wealth. I walked through the revolving doors, my faded gray coat standing in stark contrast to the polished marble lobby. A massive security desk dominated the entryway. 2 uniformed guards stepped forward, immediately blocking my path to the private elevators. The taller guard placed a hand on my chest, loudly informing me that the building was strictly by invitation only. I did not step back or raise my voice. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a solid black identification card bearing the Vanguard Trust crest. I told him to call the property manager down to the desk right this second. The guard sneered, picking up the phone to call the police instead. Before he could dial, the general manager rushed out of a back office. He recognized the crest instantly. The Vanguard Trust owned a controlling 60% stake in the parent company that managed this entire property. I was his ultimate employer. The manager shoved the guards aside, his face pale with sudden terror. He stammered a frantic apology, begging for my forgiveness. I ignored his groveling. I demanded the master override key card for the penthouse elevator. The manager handed it over with trembling hands. I walked past the stunned guards, swiped the black card, and stepped into the glass elevator. The machine shot upward, bypassing 40 floors of luxury real estate directly to the top. The doors slid open to reveal a private landing and a massive custom-built mahogany door. I stepped forward and knocked firmly on the heavy wood. The heavy mahogany door swung open. A young woman stood in the entryway holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. This was Chloe Blake's 25-year-old executive secretary. She wore a silk robe that cost more than a month of my postal pension. But my eyes bypassed the expensive clothing and locked instantly onto her throat. Resting against her collarbone was a breathtaking custom-cut diamond necklace. I recognized the distinct platinum setting immediately. 6 months ago, Monique stood in my kitchen crying because Blake told her that exact necklace was far too expensive for their 5th wedding anniversary. He claimed the company was struggling and scolded my daughter for being financially irresponsible. He made her feel guilty for wanting a symbol of his affection. Now that very same diamond necklace was wrapped around the neck of his hidden mistress. The sheer audacity of his cruelty flared in my chest, but I kept my face completely blank. Nadine taught me never to show the enemy the blade before the strike. Chloe looked me up and down, her expression twisting into arrogant annoyance. She demanded to know how I bypassed the lobby security and who I was. I did not confront her about the diamonds or her relationship with my son-in-law. I adopted the mild, exhausted posture of an overworked delivery inspector. I pulled a silver clipboard from my coat and told her I was conducting a mandatory corporate audit on all commercial lease agreements within the building. I handed her a thick stack of complex legal waivers and asked her to verify the unit's serial registration. She rolled her eyes, muttered an insult under her breath, and snatched the clipboard from my hands to sign the redundant papers. Chloe leaned against the doorframe, visibly bored as she flipped through the dense legal pages on the clipboard. She failed to notice my gaze shifting past her shoulder into the opulent penthouse entryway. A solid marble console table sat just inside the door. Resting inside a decorative silver bowl was a heavy set of car keys adorned with a gleaming Mercedes-Benz emblem. Jonathan's financial audit confirmed Blake had purchased a luxury coupe for her using Monique's drained savings. While Chloe impatiently scratched her signature onto the bottom of the audit forms, I reached into my palm and retrieved a magnetic micro GPS tracker. It was smaller than a common coin. I stepped forward smoothly, invading her personal space under the guise of pointing out a missed signature line. As she looked down at the paper, I slid my hand over the silver bowl and attached the tracker directly to the metal ring of the Mercedes keys. The magnetic clasp locked silently into place. I stepped back just as she shoved the clipboard into my chest. She slammed the heavy mahogany door in my face without saying another word. I turned around and took the private elevator straight down to the basement security office. I bypassed the guards again and walked directly up to the main surveillance terminal. I ordered the building manager to extract the last 6 months of high-definition video footage from the lobby, the private garage, and the penthouse landing. I wanted every single time-stamped frame of Blake entering and leaving this building. The manager scrambled to execute the command, downloading the massive video files onto an encrypted flash drive. I slipped the drive into my pocket. I now possessed undeniable, legally binding visual proof of Blake's hidden double life. I drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood, my mind actively processing the timeline of Blake's impending destruction. I pulled into my driveway and found a uniformed courier standing on my front porch. He held a thick, yellow, certified legal envelope requiring a direct signature. I signed the digital pad, took the heavy envelope, and walked inside my empty house. I sat down at my kitchen table, sliced the seal open with a letter opener, and pulled out a massive stack of court filings. The bold black header on the first page indicated an official Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy petition. Blake had finally pulled the trigger. He officially declared his tech startup completely insolvent to block his creditors from seizing his remaining assets. I flipped through the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the liability clauses. I stopped breathing when I reached the guarantor signatures. Blake had legally shielded himself from the financial fallout using a devastating corporate loophole. He had structured the original high-risk business loans using Monique's forged signatures. He explicitly listed my daughter as the primary personal guarantor for the entire company. The trap was masterfully evil. Because the Vanguard Trust had frozen the corporate accounts, the massive corporate debt automatically transferred to the primary guarantor. Blake was using his own wife as a human shield. Monique was now legally responsible for millions of dollars in defaulted corporate loans, while Blake's offshore slush fund in the Cayman Islands remained perfectly protected by international banking laws. He intended to walk away from his ruined marriage entirely a wealthy man, leaving my daughter completely crushed under the weight of his criminal debt. He forced my hand. It was time to wake Monique up to the absolute reality of her husband. I arranged to meet Monique for a late lunch. I chose the exact upscale bistro located on the ground floor of the Azure building. This was the precise restaurant where my security footage caught Blake and his secretary dining 3 times a week. I sat at a corner booth sipping sparkling water waiting for my daughter. Monique marched through the glass doors 10 minutes late. Her posture was rigid, her jaw clenched tight. She was armed with rehearsed arguments and a fierce determination to defend her husband. She dropped her designer purse onto the adjacent chair and refused to look at the menu. She immediately launched into a hostile tirade. She accused me of trying to sabotage Blake out of spite. She claimed I was using my supposed old age as an excuse to inflict emotional damage on a man who was only trying to build a future for their family. She demanded I stop interfering with his business and sign whatever medical and financial proxies he required to stabilize his sinking startup. She spoke with a desperate, breathless loyalty that made my chest ache. I let her speak without interruption. I listened to the frantic rationalizations of a woman completely isolated by a manipulative predator. Nadine always said that confronting a delusion directly only makes the victim cling to it tighter. You do not argue with a mirage. You simply turn on the harsh light of reality. When Monique finally ran out of breath, she crossed her arms and glared at me, expecting a screaming match. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of defense. I simply reached into my breast pocket to retrieve the truth. I pulled a thick manila envelope from my coat and laid it flat on the crisp white tablecloth. I slid the first document across the table. It was the official bank foreclosure notice stamped with the red seal of default. Monique glanced down, her eyes scanning the bold text. Her defiant glare instantly faltered. I explained that her house was scheduled to be seized by the bank at the end of the week. Before she could protest, I slid the second document forward. It was the heavily magnified copy of the second mortgage agreement. I pointed directly to the borrower's signature line. Monique stared at the ink. She knew her own handwriting intimately, and she recognized the aggressive, hurried strokes of her husband's forgery instantly. She shook her head, whispering a denial, desperately searching for a logical explanation. I did not give her time to invent one. I pulled the final piece of evidence from the envelope. I laid down 3 high-resolution photographs printed directly from the Azure Building security files. The images clearly showed Blake holding hands with his 25-year-old secretary in the lobby. The final photograph was a close-up of the young woman standing in the penthouse doorway. Resting perfectly against her collarbone was the exact platinum and diamond anniversary necklace Blake had explicitly told Monique was too expensive to purchase. I watched my daughter's eyes lock onto the diamonds. I told her the penthouse above our heads was leased entirely under the secretary's name, paid for by the very same offshore slush fund that drained her personal joint savings account. I delivered the facts with absolute surgical precision. The carefully constructed illusion Monique had lived inside for 5 years shattered right there in the middle of the restaurant. The air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. Her hands trembled violently as she picked up the photograph of the diamond necklace, her thumb tracing the glossy paper. The arrogant defensive posture vanished entirely, replaced by the crushing weight of absolute betrayal. She dropped the photo and covered her face with trembling hands. A quiet, agonizing sob escaped her throat. She realized she had not been a respected partner or a cherished wife. She had been nothing but a convenient financial shield. Blake had methodically isolated her from me, drained her generational wealth, and forged her name to protect his own cowardly hide. She wept for the years she spent defending a man who viewed her as a disposable asset. I moved to the seat beside her and wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders. I did not offer empty platitudes or tell her I warned her about him long ago. I simply held my daughter while she mourned the death of her marriage. When her tears finally slowed, a profound transformation took over her features. The crushing sorrow hardened into something entirely different. The quiet devastation in her eyes shifted into a cold, terrifying anger. She inherited her mother's resilience, and Nadine's blood was finally waking up inside her veins. She wiped her face with the linen napkin sitting up straight. She looked at the forged mortgage document and then at the photograph of the mistress. She asked me what we needed to do next. I told her we needed to secure her absolute independence. Monique snatched her phone from the table and immediately dialed Blake's private number. The line connected after 2 rings. She did not scream or cry. She spoke with a lethal, icy calm, demanding immediate answers about the Cayman Islands account, the forged mortgage signature, and the penthouse lease. Blake was caught completely off guard. He stammered for exactly 3 seconds before his cowardice took over. He terminated the call, abruptly hanging up on his own wife rather than facing his crimes. Monique redialed, but the call went straight to a disconnected automated message. Blake was already burning the bridges. Less than 10 minutes later, Monique received an automated security notification on her phone. Blake had remotely altered the access codes to their marital home's smart locks, permanently freezing her out of the property. A cold, venomous text message arrived immediately after the lock alert. Blake dropped all pretense of being a civilized human being. He gloated that he had officially finalized the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings with her name cemented as the primary corporate guarantor. He callously informed her that she would carry his massive debt for the rest of her life while he kept his offshore cash completely untouched. The final sentence of his message contained a sickening ultimatum. He threatened that if Monique attempted to fight the bankruptcy in court or contact his investors, he would instantly upload highly manipulated, severely humiliating videos of her to the internet. He intended to destroy her professional reputation and personal dignity in a public digital slaughter. He genuinely believed his vile blackmail would silence her forever. He had no idea his threat had just given the Vanguard Trust the absolute legal justification to annihilate him. The digital threat Blake sent Monique was a fatal miscalculation. Within an hour of receiving the extortion text, my legal team at Vanguard Trust forwarded the explicit digital blackmail to federal cybercrime authorities. Federal agents immediately moved to secure Blake's marital estate, cordoning off the entire property as an active crime scene. Blake had successfully locked his wife out of her own home, but he had simultaneously locked himself out of his only remaining lifeline. He was completely out of physical cash. His domestic bank accounts remained entirely frozen by the aggressive bankruptcy filings. More importantly, he realized a catastrophic flaw in his grand offshore escape plan. The Cayman Islands Bank required a rotating physical security token to authorize any external withdrawals. That encrypted digital key fob was currently sitting in the top drawer of his home office desk inside the quarantined marital estate. He possessed millions of dollars on a screen, but could not access a single cent to buy a plane ticket or even a tank of gas. Panic rapidly replaced his former arrogance. The walls were closing in and he was completely running out of places to hide. His mistress had already abandoned him the moment the penthouse lease was abruptly terminated by my property managers. Desperation drove him to make an incredibly foolish, arrogant assumption. He remembered my faded clothes, my quiet demeanor, and my insistence on living in a modest, outdated suburban house. He convinced himself that an eccentric old man who refused to utilize modern banking conveniences must hoard large amounts of physical cash inside a hidden floor safe or a locked metal strongbox. He decided to target my home. He truly believed I was an easy mark, and that breaking into a frail pensioner's house would provide the immediate, untraceable funds he desperately needed to escape the country before the authorities closed the net. The digital clock on the dashboard of Blake's rented sedan flashed midnight when he finally parked 2 blocks away from my address. He walked through the dense shadows of the quiet suburban street, staying completely off the illuminated sidewalks to avoid triggering any motion sensor lights. He gripped a heavy, solid steel crowbar tightly in his right hand. Cold sweat dripped down his face, soaking the stiff collar of his dark shirt. He bypassed the front door, entirely slipping through the wooden side gate and navigating toward the rear patio. He stopped at the large bay window looking directly into my living room. He raised the iron crowbar and smashed it violently through the reinforced glass. The thick pane shattered instantly, sending a shower of sharp, jagged fragments raining onto the hardwood floor inside. He reached carefully through the broken opening, unlatched the heavy brass lock, and pushed the sliding window frame open. Blake climbed inside the dark house, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He gripped his steel weapon tightly, fully prepared to use physical force against an elderly man if confronted. He crept out of the kitchen and moved silently down the hallway, using the dim, narrow light of his smartphone to illuminate the floorboards. His eyes darted anxiously around the space, desperately searching for a wall panel, a loose floorboard, or any indication of a hidden residential safe. He assumed my home would be cluttered with decades of accumulated junk, providing plenty of obscure hiding spots for stacks of untraceable bills. He planned to rip the place apart, take whatever capital he could physically carry, and disappear into the night without leaving a trace. He stepped cautiously into the main living area, his shoes crunching softly on the glass debris. He raised his phone to scan the corners of the room, completely unaware that his every movement was being scrutinized. Blake swept his phone screen across the living room, fully expecting to find the outdated floral sofas and dusty wooden bookshelves he remembered from his previous forced family visits. Instead, his meager light revealed absolutely nothing. The room was entirely empty. The thick woolen carpets were gone. The classic artwork had been systematically removed from the walls. Every single piece of furniture, every decorative lamp, and every personal item had been completely cleared out of the house. The space was nothing but bare, echoing walls and pristine, polished floorboards. Blake froze in the dead center of the room, his mind failing to process the sterile emptiness surrounding him. He lowered his crowbar, slightly pivoting in a slow, confused circle, suddenly realizing he had walked directly into a carefully constructed vacuum. He took a hesitant step forward, his breathing growing shallow. From the absolute darkest corner of the vacant living room, I pressed the activation switch on a military-grade tactical flashlight. A blinding high-lumen beam pierced the pitch-black darkness, hitting Blake squarely in the face. He cried out in shock, throwing his free hand up to shield his retinas from the intensely aggressive glare. He stumbled backward, losing his grip. His heavy steel crowbar clattered loudly against the bare wood, the sound echoing sharply through the empty house. I remained perfectly seated in the single solitary folding chair I had kept for this exact occasion. I kept the blinding circle of light perfectly centered on his terrified features. He squinted through the harsh beam, his chest heaving with sheer, unfiltered panic. I did not move toward him or raise my voice. I simply asked him if he was looking for his dignity. The silence that followed was absolute. He realized instantly that I had anticipated his exact arrival. I knew his financial avenues were blocked. I knew his offshore token was secured by federal agents, and I knew exactly what a desperate, cowardly man would do when finally cornered. Before Blake could formulate a single pathetic excuse or bend down to retrieve his dropped weapon, the quiet suburban street outside erupted into absolute chaos. A violent wash of red and blue emergency lights flooded through the front windows, casting harsh, strobing shadows against the bare living room walls. The piercing shriek of multiple police sirens cut through the midnight air, converging directly on my address from every direction. Blake spun around, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. He had completely failed to notice the discreet, high-definition optical lenses mounted perfectly in the upper corners of the ceiling. My entire property was wired with a state-of-the-art Vanguard security system. The exact moment his crowbar shattered the rear window glass, the network automatically initiated a secure encrypted live stream directly to the local police precinct and the federal cybercrime division. The authorities had watched him execute a premeditated, armed home invasion in stunning real time. The booming, amplified voice of a police lieutenant echoed through a bullhorn outside, ordering the suspect to exit the premises immediately with his hands raised. The catastrophic realization of his total doom hit Blake like a physical blow. The corporate bankruptcy fraud, the digital blackmail, the offshore money laundering, and now a felony armed home invasion had all coalesced into a permanent, inescapable prison sentence. Total blinding panic overrode all remaining logical thought. He abandoned his crowbar, turned away from the barricaded front door, and sprinted back toward the kitchen. He vaulted recklessly through the shattered bay window, tearing his expensive jacket and slicing his arm on the jagged glass. He hit the patio hard, scrambled desperately to his feet, and sprinted wildly toward the dense tree line bordering the back edge of my property. I sat quietly in my folding chair and turned off the tactical flashlight. Blake was no longer a fraudulent executive hiding behind a corporate desk. He was officially a fleeing fugitive running blind and bleeding into the dark. The freezing dampness of the suburban woods clung to Blake's ruined clothes as the morning sun began to breach the city skyline. He had spent the last 7 hours shivering in a drainage culvert, hiding from the sweeping spotlight of police helicopters. His luxury car was abandoned. His offshore accounts were securely locked behind physical tokens he could no longer reach. His entire existence had been reduced to the clothes on his back and the desperate, frantic pounding of his heart. But Blake still possessed one final card to play. He knew the source code housed inside his tech startup's proprietary servers was completely unencrypted. If he could physically extract those primary hard drives, he could sell the core algorithms to an aggressive foreign competitor for millions in untraceable cryptocurrency. It was his only ticket onto a cargo ship out of the country. He approached the towering glass headquarters of his company through the subterranean loading dock. He moved like a hunted animal, flinching at every passing shadow and the distant wail of sirens. He slipped past the distracted morning delivery crews, utilizing the blind spots he had personally mapped out when designing the building's layout. His lungs burned with exhaustion, but the promise of a multi-million-dollar payday fueled his frantic sprint up the concrete emergency stairwell. He climbed 12 flights of stairs, bypassing the main lobby to avoid the reception staff and the front desk security guards. He reached the heavy reinforced steel door separating the stairwell from the executive server room. He smoothed down his torn collar, wiped the dried mud from his face, and pulled his secure CEO identification badge from his pocket. He just needed 5 minutes inside that room to steal his salvation. Blake pressed his executive identification badge firmly against the black biometric scanner mounted beside the steel door. He expected the familiar, satisfying chime of authorization. Instead, the scanner emitted a harsh, flat buzz. The LED indicator flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. Access denied. Blake stared at the device in absolute disbelief. He swiped the card a second time, pressing it aggressively against the glass sensor. The red light flashed again. He pounded his fist against the reinforced steel, demanding the door to open. He was the founder of this company. He was the chief executive officer. The system was utterly unresponsive. Before he could strike the door a third time, the soft chime of the executive glass elevator echoed through the corridor. The polished stainless steel doors slid apart with a quiet hiss. Blake whipped around, his teeth bared, ready to order whichever low-level employee was arriving to manually override the server lock. The words died instantly in his throat. I stepped out of the elevator. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, perfectly pressed and immaculate. I stood tall, my posture radiating the absolute authority that Blake had spent 5 years mocking. I did not look like the faded, easily manipulated pensioner he had continuously insulted at his dinner table. I looked exactly like the apex predator of the corporate ecosystem. I adjusted my silk tie and looked down at my son-in-law. Blake stood frozen in his muddy, shredded clothing, his face scratched by tree branches and his eyes wide with cornered panic. He looked from my polished shoes to the red light on the scanner, slowly realizing that the system had not malfunctioned. The biometric locks had been intentionally reprogrammed to shut him out completely. I clasped my hands behind my back and approached him. I informed Blake that his security credentials had been permanently revoked at precisely 6 o'clock this morning. I explained that when he formally filed his Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition to evade his creditors, he triggered a catastrophic default clause within his primary venture capital agreements. The Vanguard Trust immediately executed its absolute right to activate the debt covenant. I told him the truth plainly. The towering glass building, the intellectual property, the source code, and the proprietary servers sitting behind that steel door no longer belonged to his failing startup. They belonged entirely to me. I had just acquired his entire professional legacy for pennies on the dollar. The sheer magnitude of his total defeat fractured the last remaining pieces of his sanity. A raw, guttural scream ripped from his chest. All his polished corporate charm evaporated into pure, violent rage. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight toward me with his fists raised, intending to tear me apart with his bare hands. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. Before Blake could cross the polished floor, 2 massive private security contractors stepped out of the elevator bay. They moved with terrifying speed. The lead guard hit Blake squarely in the chest, driving him backward. The second guard swept Blake's legs out from under him. They slammed him ruthlessly onto the hard marble floor. The impact echoed sharply down the hallway. One guard pinned Blake's arms behind his back in a brutal joint lock, while the other drove a heavy knee into his shoulder blade, immobilizing him completely. Blake gasped for air, his face smashed flat against the cold stone, utterly powerless to break free. Blake violently jerked his head to the side, spitting a thick wad of blood and saliva onto the pristine marble floor. His lip was split from the impact, but the physical pain was entirely eclipsed by his absolute venomous hatred. He strained against the massive hands pinning him down, his neck flushed crimson. He tilted his head back and screamed that I would never get away with this corporate slaughter. He declared that he was not completely finished. He promised to take his story directly to the largest, most aggressive tabloid in the city. He shrieked that he would burn my name to ashes across every digital news outlet and front page in the state. He vowed to spin a devastating public narrative painting me as a ruthless, corrupt slumlord who used dirty offshore money to orchestrate a hostile takeover. He sneered, claiming the media would eagerly devour a sensational story about a wealthy, manipulative old man intentionally destroying a brilliant, innocent white entrepreneur. He guaranteed the resulting public outrage would spark federal investigations into the Vanguard Trust, shattering my privacy and forcing my empire into the devastating light of public scrutiny. He promised to rally his defrauded investors and the public against me, turning my victory into a toxic scandal that would follow my family for generations. He believed his sheer audacity and racial victimhood would serve as the ultimate equalizer. He panted heavily, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, expecting to see a flicker of hesitation or fear at the threat of a massive public relations disaster. He truly believed his fabricated media crusade would force me to negotiate a silent, lucrative settlement to preserve my anonymity. He was entirely convinced he held the upper hand. Blake sat across the scarred wooden desk from Marcus Vance, the managing editor of the city's most notorious digital tabloid. His lip was still swollen from his violent encounter with my security team, a physical detail he eagerly exploited to sell his fabricated narrative. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with rehearsed indignation, and spun a masterful web of absolute fiction. He painted himself as the brilliant, innocent victim of a corrupt corporate machine orchestrated by a senile, power-hungry old man. He deliberately weaponized his racial identity, claiming he was the target of malicious reverse discrimination and a hostile, illegal takeover driven by pure spite. He described me as a ruthless slumlord who used dirty offshore money to steal his proprietary software and violently assault him in his own lobby. Marcus Vance listened with a predatory gleam in his eyes. He did not care about verifying a single fact or requesting corporate documentation. He only cared about the explosive, scandalous nature of the allegations. A story featuring corporate theft, racial tension, and a dramatic physical altercation in a high-rise lobby was guaranteed to generate millions of lucrative clicks. Vance eagerly called his lead copywriter into the office and ordered them to draft a sensationalist front-page expose. He promised Blake that the article would go live across all their digital platforms and affiliate networks by noon. Blake leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smirk replacing his desperate panic. He genuinely believed he had successfully launched a devastating preemptive strike against my reputation. He thought he had outmaneuvered me by controlling the public narrative. He walked out of the tabloid headquarters fully confident that his fabricated victimhood would force me to surrender my newly acquired assets to protect my family's privacy. Exactly 55 minutes before the fabricated expose was scheduled to hit the digital presses, the heavy glass door of the editor's private office swung open. Jonathan walked into the room with the quiet, terrifying authority of an executioner. He did not ask for permission to enter, and he did not introduce himself to the startled receptionist outside. Marcus Vance stood up from his desk, his face flushing red with anger as he demanded to know who Jonathan was and how he had bypassed the building's security protocols. Jonathan completely ignored the blustering demands. He stepped forward and dropped a thick, unmarked black folder directly onto the center of the cluttered desk. He advised the editor to review the contents thoroughly before publishing a single word regarding my family or the Vanguard Trust. Vance sneered, reaching for his desk phone to summon security, but his eyes caught the first page of the open dossier. The blood drained instantly from his face. The folder did not contain a cease and desist letter or a standard threat of defamation litigation. It contained deeply buried, heavily encrypted financial records exposing Vance's massive offshore tax evasion schemes. Jonathan systematically laid out the full extent of the editor's illicit activities. He presented irrefutable proof of Vance's crippling gambling debts tied to illegal underground sportsbooks, along with the subsequent wire transfers he used to quietly embezzle funds from his own publishing company to cover his devastating losses. Jonathan explained with absolute chilling clarity that the Vanguard network had acquired complete digital access to every single one of Vance's hidden accounts. The editor stared at the documents in absolute horror, his breathing shallow and rapid. He realized he was not dealing with a fragile target who could be bullied by a cheap internet smear campaign. Jonathan stood silently, allowing the crushing weight of the financial evidence to entirely suffocate the editor's remaining bravado. He leaned over the desk and delivered a simple, non-negotiable ultimatum. Vance would immediately and permanently delete the drafted article targeting my family scrub, all associated metadata from their corporate servers, and formally ban Blake from ever stepping foot inside the building again. If he refused, Jonathan promised to forward the entire black folder to the federal tax authorities and the publishing company's board of directors within 60 seconds. The choice was between deleting a sensational lie or spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement and tax fraud. Vance did not hesitate for a single second. His hands shook violently as he unlocked his desktop computer and accessed the central publishing matrix. He deleted the drafted expose, bypassed the system recycle bin, and purged the article entirely from the server's active memory. He He then picked up his phone and instructed his front desk security team that Blake was now considered a hostile trespasser and was to be denied entry under all possible circumstances. Jonathan watched the digital deletion confirm on the screen. He picked up the black folder, turned around, and walked out of the office without offering a parting word. The devastating media smear campaign that Blake had relied upon to destroy my reputation died completely before taking a single breath. His desperate attempt to manipulate the public narrative was entirely neutralized by the absolute superiority of the Vanguard intelligence network. I did not need to defend myself against his vicious lies in the court of public opinion. I simply choked his platform into absolute submission. Blake's final offensive weapon had been dismantled, leaving him utterly defenseless against the storm he had foolishly summoned. Blake strode out of the newspaper headquarters, completely oblivious to the fact that his digital crusade had already been vaporized. He walked down the busy downtown sidewalk, adjusting his torn jacket and mentally calculating his next move. He planned to leverage the impending media chaos to extort a massive cash settlement from my trust. His arrogant daydreaming was abruptly interrupted when two massive, broad-shouldered men stepped seamlessly out of a nearby alleyway, entirely blocking his path. They did not look like corporate security guards or plainclothes police officers. They wore dark, heavy coats, and their faces bore the hardened, scarred features of professional violence. Blake tried to step around them, snapping at them to move aside, but the larger of the two men slammed a heavy hand directly into Blake's chest, driving him backward into the brick wall of the building. The breath left Blake's lungs in a sharp gasp. The second man stepped uncomfortably close, invading his personal space. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice that carried a terrifying promise of physical pain. He informed Blake that their mutual employer was extremely unhappy with the sudden freeze on his domestic bank accounts. Blake had borrowed heavily from an aggressive underground loan shark to provide the initial seed capital for his Cayman Islands slush fund, fully intending to pay it back once his fraudulent bankruptcy cleared. The enforcer grabbed Blake by the collar, twisting the fabric tightly against his throat. He delivered a brutal, uncompromising mandate. Blake owed them exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash by midnight tonight. The enforcer leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He promised that if Blake failed to deliver the money, they would not come looking for him. They would pay a midnight visit to his beautiful wife, Monique, instead. Monique sat perfectly still in the center of the dimly lit living room of the private suburban safe house Jonathan had secured for her. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight against the evening chill, masking the interior light from the street. She clutched her phone in her lap, her knuckles white, listening to the aggressive crunch of heavy boots on the gravel driveway outside. Blake's absolute cowardice had brought violent predators directly to her doorstep. The men did not bother looking for a doorbell. A massive, deafening pound shuddered through the solid oak front door, rattling the hinges and sending a shockwave of raw terror down Monique's spine. The lead enforcer outside shouted her name, his voice a low, gravelly bark that carried an unmistakable promise of physical harm. He demanded that she open the door immediately to settle her husband's delinquent offshore financing. He aggressively kicked the wooden frame, warning her that the reinforced deadbolt would only slow them down for a matter of seconds. He stated clearly that Blake owed them $50,000 in cash by midnight, and since her husband had chosen to flee like a rat, the debt had officially defaulted to her. Monique backed away into the hallway, pressing her spine against the cold plaster wall. Her breathing turned into shallow, panicked gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut, paralyzed by the horrific reality that the man she had loved and defended for 5 years had intentionally offered her up as collateral to ruthless underground criminals. The violent pounding escalated into a steady, rhythmic hammering that threatened to splinter the doorframe entirely. The loan sharks yelled that their patience had expired and they were coming inside to collect what was owed, whether she opened the lock or not. The aggressive hammering abruptly ceased, replaced by the sudden deafening roar of 3 high-performance engines surging down the quiet residential street. Brilliant white halogen headlights flooded the front yard, completely blinding the 2 enforcers on the porch. 3 matte black, heavily armored SUVs swerved violently into the driveway, executing a perfectly synchronized tactical maneuver that instantly boxed in the loan shark's unmarked sedan. The vehicles slammed into park, simultaneously blocking any possible avenue of escape. The doors of the SUVs swung open with lethal precision. 6 massive, broad-shouldered men stepped out onto the gravel. They did not wear police uniforms or security badges. They wore unmarked tactical gear, their posture radiating the cold, disciplined authority of former military operators. They fanned out across the lawn in total silence, forming an impenetrable perimeter around the front porch. The two loan sharks froze completely, their hands hovering nervously over their concealed weapons. They recognized immediately that they were entirely outmatched and outgunned by absolute professionals. I stepped calmly out of the rear passenger door of the center SUV. I wore my tailored charcoal suit, my expression completely blank and devoid of any fear. I walked up the driveway with slow, measured steps, my leather shoes crunching methodically against the loose stones. The tactical contractors parted seamlessly to let me pass. The lead enforcer swallowed hard, his previous bravado vanishing entirely under the crushing weight of the sudden ambush. He instinctively took a step back from the front door, raising his hands slightly to signal he did not want a violent escalation. I stopped at the base of the wooden porch steps and looked directly into his eyes, projecting the undeniable authority of a man who owned the very ground he was standing on. I did not ask the men for their names or offer any pleasantries. I simply reached into the back seat of my vehicle and retrieved a heavy black canvas duffel bag. I walked directly toward their trapped sedan and tossed the bag onto the hood. The dense thud of banded currency echoed loudly in the crisp night air. I instructed the lead enforcer to unzip the canvas. He stepped forward cautiously, pulled back the heavy zipper, and stared down at the contents. He found stacks of immaculate, untraceable $100 bills perfectly bound in bank straps. I informed him that the bag contained exactly $100,000 in pure liquid cash. I explained that the first $50,000 completely covered Blake's delinquent interest penalty for the evening. The remaining $50,000 was a massive premium acquisition fee. I looked the enforcer squarely in the jaw and declared that I was officially purchasing the entirety of Blake's outstanding illicit debt. I was buying his markers, his offshore liabilities, and his life. The underground predators were businessmen first, and they recognized a flawlessly executed buyout when they saw one. The massive cash premium instantly erased any lingering hostility. The lead enforcer nodded eagerly, pulling a thick folded ledger from his inner jacket pocket. My tactical contractor stepped forward and handed him a customized legal transfer document drafted by Jonathan an hour prior. The loan shark happily signed the transfer papers against the hood of his car, officially relinquishing all claims over Blake's financial obligations directly to me. He zipped up the canvas duffel bag, gestured for his partner to fall back, and quickly entered his vehicle. My contractors silently shifted their SUVs, allowing the predators to drive away into the night, permanently severing Blake's final underground tether. I pulled my encrypted cellular phone from my breast pocket and dialed the burner number Jonathan had traced to Blake's exact geographical coordinates. He was currently hiding in a cheap cash-only motel on the absolute outskirts of the county. The line connected on the third ring. Blake answered with a ragged, terrified breath, expecting the loan sharks to demand their payment. I spoke his name with a quiet, lethal calmness that froze the blood in his veins. I informed him that the underground enforcers he sent to terrorize my daughter were gone, and they were never coming back. I explained that I had just purchased his illicit offshore financing in its absolute entirety. I let the crushing reality of that transaction settle into his panicked mind. I told him that I was now his primary, legally binding creditor. The Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy he filed to shield himself was entirely useless against a privately held, legally transferred underground debt. He could not run, he could not hide, and he could not use corporate loopholes to erase what he owed me. The Vanguard Trust now owned every single aspect of his financial existence. He belonged to me completely. Blake tried to stammer a pathetic apology, but I cut him off instantly. I delivered my final non-negotiable ultimatum. He would arrive at the downtown family courthouse tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. He would sit across from Monique and sign the expedited, uncontested divorce settlement, handing over full custody of all remaining domestic assets, or I would personally execute the unpayable debt covenant and bury him under federal fraud charges. I hung up the phone before he could utter a single word, leaving him completely trapped in his miserable motel room to await his total destruction. Blake pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B at precisely 8 o'clock. He wore a wrinkled suit, clearly attempting to salvage whatever scraps of dignity remained from his ruined corporate wardrobe. Beside him walked a cheap court-appointed attorney, a stark contrast to the high-priced legal fixers he once employed. Despite his devastating losses the previous night, Blake's inherent narcissism refused to die. He strutted to the respondent's table with a manufactured swagger, deliberately ignoring the bruise swelling on his lower lip. He genuinely believed that the family court system would view him as a marginalized victim. The moment the judge called the session to order, Blake instructed his budget attorney to launch an incredibly audacious offensive. His lawyer cleared his throat and officially demanded exorbitant spousal support and exactly 50% of Monique's future earnings effective immediately. Blake leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a deeply arrogant smirk. He argued that his sudden tragic unemployment left him completely destitute and unable to survive in the current market. He shamelessly claimed that his wife's wealthy family had maliciously orchestrated a hostile corporate takeover to ruin his brilliant career, rendering him entirely financially dependent on her continuing success. He painted himself as a devoted, hardworking husband who had been cruelly stripped of his livelihood by a vindictive, wealthy father-in-law. He demanded that Monique be forced to maintain the lavish lifestyle he had grown accustomed to over the past 5 years of their marriage. He glared across the aisle, projecting absolute, unwavering arrogance, fully expecting the presiding judge to sympathize with his fabricated plight. He had absolutely no concept of the total legal annihilation waiting for him on our side of the room. Monique sat beside me at the petitioner's table, her posture perfectly straight and her expression carved from solid stone. She did not shed a single tear or break eye contact with the man who had tried to destroy her life. She looked entirely unaffected by Blake's pathetic, grasping demands. Jonathan stepped forward to take the floor, holding a thick black leather briefcase. He did not raise his voice or engage in cheap theatrical courtroom arguments. He simply began dismantling Blake's entire existence piece by piece. Jonathan approached the bench and submitted the first exhibit. It was a comprehensive, undeniable ledger of the Cayman Islands bank statements tracing every single stolen dollar directly from Monique's joint savings to Blake's hidden offshore slush fund. Blake's smug expression instantly cracked. Jonathan then submitted the certified digital copy of the luxury penthouse lease, complete with the signature of the 25-year-old secretary. Before Blake's attorney could even formulate a weak objection, Jonathan delivered the killing blow. He placed a sworn, notarized affidavit directly in front of the judge. It was a comprehensive testimony from Blake's former mistress, who had eagerly traded her silence for full legal immunity the moment my investigators cornered her. The affidavit detailed their 5-year affair and explicitly confirmed Blake's premeditated intention to leave his wife utterly bankrupt. To seal the casket, Jonathan laid out the heavily magnified mortgage agreements alongside a forensic handwriting analysis, unequivocally proving Blake had maliciously forged Monique's signature to secure the second loan. Jonathan presented the evidence with absolute surgical precision, turning Blake's narrative of victimhood into a documented trail of predatory financial abuse. The mountain of irrefutable proof completely suffocated the courtroom, leaving Blake's cheap lawyer stammering and utterly defenseless against the crushing reality of his client's crimes. The presiding judge adjusted his glasses and spent 10 long minutes reviewing the heavily documented exhibits. As he turned each page, the color drained from his face, rapidly replaced by a dark, simmering outrage. The judge finally looked up from the Vanguard dossier, his eyes locking onto Blake with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He silenced Blake's attorney with a single sharp strike of his wooden gavel. The judge stated clearly that in his 30 years on the bench, he had rarely witnessed such a profound, calculated level of financial and emotional betrayal. He did not mince his words. He entirely dismissed Blake's audacious request for spousal support, calling the demand a sickening insult to the court's intelligence. With swift, merciless judicial authority, the judge stripped Blake of every single remaining marital asset. He awarded Monique immediate and total ownership of the primary residential estate, all vehicles, and the remaining domestic investment portfolios. But the devastating judgment did not end with the division of property. The judge formally nullified the forged mortgage agreement, transferring the entire burden of that fraudulent debt squarely onto Blake's shoulders. He then ordered Blake to pay massive immediate restitution for the offshore funds he had callously embezzled from his wife. The judge looked down from the bench and explicitly warned Blake that the undeniable financial fraud evidence was already being forwarded to the district attorney for severe criminal prosecution. Blake sat completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging open as the judge methodically dismantled his entire future. Every single legal shield he had tried to raise was permanently shattered. He had walked into the courtroom expecting a lucrative payday. He was walking out completely stripped of his wealth, his marriage and his freedom buried under a mountain of mandated restitution he could never repay. Blake stumbled out of the heavy courtroom doors, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was completely destitute, definitively stripped of his corporate empire, his marital safety net, and his false pride. He pushed through the bustling courthouse lobby and walked out into the harsh morning sunlight, descending the wide concrete steps with the staggering gait of a broken man. At the bottom of the stairs, a familiar figure waited by the curb. It was his former secretary, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. Blake's eyes lit up with a brief, pathetic flicker of hope, foolishly believing that his mistress had come to offer him comfort or a temporary place to hide. He rushed toward her, reaching out his shaking hands. Before he could speak a single word, she stepped forward and delivered a vicious, ringing slap directly across his bruised face. The sharp impact snapped his head to the side. She screamed at him, her voice echoing sharply across the busy public plaza. She shrieked that she had just tried to access the Cayman Islands account to withdraw her promised severance. The offshore bank had completely locked her out. She aggressively informed Blake that my Vanguard cybersecurity team had officially frozen the foreign funds earlier that morning, flagging the entire account for international money laundering. The millions of dollars he had promised her were permanently seized by federal authorities. She cursed him loudly, calling him a pathetic, broke coward who had completely ruined her life. She turned on her heel, hailed a passing taxi, and left him standing alone on the courthouse curb. Blake stood paralyzed on the concrete, his cheeks stinging, and his pockets entirely empty. The absolute reality of his total isolation finally crushed him. He had absolutely nothing left. The harsh reality of the courthouse curb vanished behind a singular, desperate objective. Blake had to vanish. He possessed absolutely no liquid capital, no corporate shelter, and a looming federal indictment hovering over his head. His only remaining asset of any tangible value was the heavy platinum chronograph secured around his left wrist, a lavish anniversary gift he had selfishly demanded from Monique 3 years prior. He navigated the grimy, rain-slicked alleys of the city's industrial district, far from the polished marble lobbies he once commanded. He pushed through the reinforced steel door of an illegal underground syndicate he previously used to quietly erase his corporate gambling markers. The cramped, windowless room reeked of stale tobacco and ozone. Blake slammed the luxury watch onto the scratched metal counter, demanding a clean, untraceable travel document. The syndicate broker inspected the timepiece with agonizing slowness, well aware of Blake's sudden, catastrophic fall from grace. The broker offered him a mere fraction of the watch's actual value, capitalizing perfectly on the disgraced executive's absolute desperation. Blake had no leverage to negotiate. He accepted the insultingly low offer, trading his final symbol of wealth for a fabricated identity and a one-way commercial ticket to a non-extradition jurisdiction in Eastern Europe. He gripped the dark blue counterfeit passport in his trembling hands. He convinced himself that he could easily rebuild his empire abroad. He planned to leverage his stolen corporate knowledge and charismatic manipulation to secure new, unsuspecting foreign investors. He believed that crossing an international border would instantly sever my financial grip and nullify the crushing restitution the judge had mandated. He walked out of the syndicate's hideout with a renewed, arrogant sense of survival, totally unaware that my Vanguard intelligence team was already monitoring the airspace. The fluorescent lights of the international departure terminal felt aggressively bright against Blake's exhausted, bloodshot eyes. He blended into the dense, shuffling crowds of late-night travelers, keeping his head down and his torn collar pulled high. He had bypassed the premium lounges and expedited security lanes he used to frequent, forced to wait in the agonizingly slow, winding queues of commercial economy class. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He flinched at the sound of rolling luggage and darted his eyes toward every uniformed officer patrolling the concourse. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he finally approached the brightly lit airline counter. The ticketing agent, a bored young woman chewing gum, extended her hand without looking up. Blake handed over his heavily forged passport and his printed boarding pass. His palms were slick with cold sweat. He forced a rigid, artificial smile, desperately attempting to project the calm, entitled demeanor of a weary business traveler. The agent swiped the dark blue booklet through the optical scanner embedded in her keyboard. Blake held his breath, his muscles coiling tight, entirely focused on the small digital monitor angled away from his view. The machine emitted a sharp mechanical whir as it processed the encoded biometric data. Time seemed to drag into a grueling, suffocating eternity. Blake watched the agent's eyes flick across her screen, waiting for the familiar nod of approval and the printing of his luggage tags. He mentally rehearsed his confident stride toward the departure gate, envisioning the dark cabin of the transatlantic flight that would carry him far away from my reach. He just needed the machine to accept the fabricated barcode. He just needed one final stroke of unearned luck. Instead of the standard green confirmation, the agent's monitor abruptly flashed a solid, glaring red. The system emitted a sharp, continuous warning chime that instantly cut through the ambient noise of the busy terminal. The young woman stopped chewing her gum. Her bored expression vanished instantly, replaced by rigid, trained caution. She did not hand the passport back. Instead, she quietly pressed a concealed button beneath her desk and politely asked Blake to wait just one moment while she verified a system error. The sudden agonizing delay shattered Blake's fragile composure. He leaned over the high counter, his eyes frantically scanning the glowing red text reflecting off the agent's glasses. He realized instantly that the forgery had not failed. The system had actively flagged his biometric profile. My legal team had not simply rested after the devastating courtroom victory. Jonathan had aggressively anticipated Blake's cowardly flight response. Hours before Blake even purchased his fake documents, Vanguard Trust had formally submitted the judge's ruling and the undeniable evidence of offshore embezzlement directly to federal prosecutors. The staggering financial magnitude of the corporate fraud had immediately triggered a high-level federal flight risk injunction. Homeland Security had placed Blake on an absolute, heavily monitored no-fly list. Any attempt to cross an international border, regardless of the name printed on the document, automatically triggered a silent nationwide alarm. Blake stood frozen at the counter, the blood rushing in his ears. He realized that my trap had been perfectly laid long before he even arrived at the airport. I had not just stripped him of his assets. I had systematically built an invisible, impenetrable wall around him. He was completely boxed in, snared in a digital net that he could not outrun. Blake's peripheral vision caught the sudden, urgent movement of 4 heavily armed federal officers rapidly converging on the ticketing counter from both sides of the terminal. The realization of his imminent arrest hijacked his remaining senses. Total, unfiltered panic overrode all logic. Without a single word, he abandoned his ticket, his forged passport, and his meager duffel bag. He violently shoved a startled elderly traveler backward into a luggage cart, using the resulting chaos and screams to break the agent's line of sight. He sprinted frantically through the dense crowd, knocking over display stands and scattering terrified passengers. He burst through the sliding glass exit doors and hit the humid night air at a full sprint. A yellow commercial taxi idled at the curb, its engine running, while the driver loaded a passenger's suitcases into the open trunk. Blake did not hesitate. He lunged into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut and violently engaging the transmission. The taxi's tires screamed against the concrete pavement as he floored the accelerator. He wildly swerved away from the terminal, sideswiping a concrete barrier and tearing off the side mirror in his desperate haste. He sped recklessly down the airport access highway, constantly checking the rear-view mirror for the flashing lights of pursuing squad cars. He was breathing in ragged, frantic gasps, his hands gripping the stolen steering wheel with white-knuckled terror. His master plan to escape to Europe was completely dead. He had no offshore funds, no domestic assets, no identification, and no allies. He had escalated his situation from white-collar corporate fraud to grand theft auto and fleeing federal custody. Blake drove blindly into the dark, sprawling city, officially a hunted fugitive with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Blake drove the stolen commercial taxi until the fuel needle buried itself into the red zone. He abandoned the vehicle behind an abandoned strip mall on the absolute desolate fringe of the city. He walked 2 miles through the freezing drizzle until he reached a decaying cash-only roadside motel. He paid for a single night using the last crumpled $20 bills he had scavenged from the stolen taxi's center console. The room was a claustrophobic nightmare of peeling yellow wallpaper-stained carpet and the heavy stench of stale cigarette smoke. Blake locked the flimsy wooden door and shoved a rusted dresser against the frame. He collapsed onto the sagging mattress, pulling his knees to his chest. His designer clothes were caked in dried mud and stained with his own dried blood. His stomach twisted with sharp, aggressive hunger pangs, but he had absolutely no money left for food. The crushing weight of his catastrophic failure pressed down on his chest, fracturing his remaining sanity. He paced the narrow floorboards like a feral, cornered animal. Every passing set of headlights outside the window made him flinch, expecting federal agents to kick down the door. He had lost his company, his offshore millions, his freedom, and his reputation. The corporate armor he had worn for 5 years was completely gone. As the cold night dragged on, a desperate, venomous idea crystallized in his mind. He realized he had one final pathetic weapon left to deploy. He could no longer fight me in a courtroom or a boardroom. He had to attack my family's conscience. He believed Monique was still fundamentally soft, still vulnerable to the psychological conditioning he had subjected her to for half a decade. He decided to leverage the ultimate emotional extortion. Blake retrieved a prepaid burner phone he had stolen from the taxi driver's glove compartment. He dialed the familiar digits of Monique's private number, his hands shaking violently from exhaustion and plunging blood sugar. He listened to the dial tone, silently rehearsing the exact cadence of a broken, desperate man. The line connected. He did not wait for her to speak. He immediately launched into a frantic, breathless monologue designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma. He wept openly, letting his voice crack and tremble, playing the role of a brilliant man pushed entirely to the brink of insanity. He told his wife that he was standing on the precipice of absolute darkness, staring down at an unforgiving concrete drop. He claimed the relentless, vindictive crusade orchestrated by her father had completely destroyed his mental health. He sobbed that he had absolutely nothing left to live for, and that he was going to end his own life before the sun came up. Blake paused, waiting for the familiar sound of Monique's panicked reassurance, but only dead silence echoed through the receiver. He escalated his vile extortion. He threatened to leave a highly publicized, digitally distributed suicide note explicitly naming me as his murderer. He promised to outline how a wealthy, corrupt slumlord had relentlessly hunted a struggling entrepreneur to the point of a tragic, inescapable end. He swore that the media would crucify her father, and that Monique would have to live with the overwhelming guilt of my actions for the rest of her natural life. He demanded she transfer a massive sum of emergency cryptocurrency to a secure wallet, immediately framing it as the only possible way to pull him back from the absolute edge of oblivion. Monique stood by the window of the secure Vanguard safe house, staring out into the quiet suburban night. She held the phone to her ear, listening to the frantic, weeping threats pouring from her husband's mouth. 6 months ago, a call like this would have shattered her completely. She would have panicked, emptied her savings, and begged him to come home. But the carefully constructed illusion of her marriage had been surgically dismantled. She did not shed a single tear. Her breathing remained perfectly steady, her heartbeat entirely calm. She recognized the pathetic display for exactly what it was, a cowardly, cornered predator deploying his absolute last mechanism of control. She channeled the cold, unwavering resilience of her father. When Blake finally stopped talking to catch his breath, expecting her desperate capitulation, Monique delivered her response with icy, lethal precision. She did not raise her voice or offer a single syllable of comfort. She told Blake that the devastating consequences he was currently facing were the direct result of his own calculated greed, his systematic forgery, and his arrogant betrayal. She stated clearly that his choices moving forward belonged entirely to him, and she absolutely refused to carry the emotional burden of his cowardice for one more second. She advised him to surrender to the federal authorities and face his mandated punishment like a man. Before Blake could utter another frantic threat or deploy another emotional weapon, Monique pressed the red button on her screen. She terminated the call and immediately blocked the burner number. She placed the device face down on the table, feeling a profound, immense weight lift from her shoulders. The psychological chains Blake had meticulously wrapped around her mind for 5 years were permanently shattered. Blake stared at the disconnected screen of the stolen burner phone, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The dial tone hissed loudly in the cramped, filthy motel room. The total rejection hit him with the force of a physical blow. Monique had not broken. She had not rushed to his rescue. His ultimate psychological weapon had failed completely, bouncing off an impenetrable wall of newly forged resolve. The shock rapidly mutated into a blind, explosive fury. Blake hurled the plastic phone against the peeling wallpaper, shattering the device into a dozen jagged pieces. He screamed at the top of his lungs, a raw, guttural roar of unfiltered hatred that echoed through the empty hallway outside. If he could not manipulate my daughter to secure his escape, and if he was destined to spend the rest of his natural life rotting inside a federal penitentiary, he would ensure I paid a catastrophic price for my victory. He decided to physically destroy the one tangible object that represented my family's legacy. He stormed out of the motel room, moving with the terrifying singular focus of a madman. He walked a mile to an all-night industrial supply station using the final stolen taxi bills to purchase 2 heavy red plastic jerry cans and fill them entirely with premium, highly flammable gasoline. He stole an idling utility truck from the station's parking lot, tossing the heavy fuel containers into the passenger seat. The overwhelming stench of raw vapor filled the cab. Blake gripped the steering wheel, his eyes burning with absolute malice. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, steering the heavy vehicle directly toward the quiet suburban neighborhood where my old family house stood. He intended to burn my history to ashes before the police could finally put him in chains. The stolen utility truck rattled to a halt a block away from the dark suburban property. Blake killed the headlights and sat in the suffocating blackness, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy stench of raw gasoline from the 2 red jerry cans in the passenger seat filled his nose, sharpening his unhinged focus. He climbed out into the damp midnight air, lifting the heavy plastic containers with trembling, mud-slicked hands. He crept across the dark lawn, avoiding the open spaces, his eyes locked onto the dark facade of the old family house. For 5 years he had despised this structure and the generational resilience it represented. Now completely stripped of his empire and facing federal ruin, his mind had broken entirely. He stepped onto the wooden porch, the planks groaning softly beneath his weight. With frantic, unhinged movements, he unscrewed the caps and began splashing the fuel over the old wood. He poured the amber liquid aggressively across the threshold, soaking the base of the front door and coating the supporting pillars. The toxic fumes made his eyes water, but he only pressed forward, emptying the second can until the entire entryway was entirely saturated. He threw the empty plastic containers into the bushes and reached into his damp pocket for his lighter. His fumbling fingers managed to strike a small wooden match he had salvaged from the motel. The tiny yellow flame flickered defensively against the midnight breeze, casting a brief, monstrous glow across his hollow face. Blake sneered into the darkness, filled with a blinding desire to erase the physical manifestation of my family's history. He dropped the burning match directly into the pool of gasoline. The amber pool ignited with a violent, concussive whoosh. A towering wall of bright orange flame roared to life, instantly engulfing the entire front door and climbing the saturated wooden pillars. The extreme heat blasted back into Blake's face, singing his hair and lighting up the dark street with a terrifying brilliance. He staggered back onto the damp grass, completely transfixed by the destructive beauty of the inferno. A manic, guttural laugh escaped his throat, echoing through the empty suburban neighborhood as he watched my history ignite. In his fractured mind, the roaring flames represented his final, definitive triumph over the Vanguard Trust. He expected the structure to burn completely to the ground, taking every hidden secret and financial record with it. He stood in the front yard, completely exposed, basking in the warmth of his ultimate vengeance. But the chaotic celebration lasted less than 10 seconds. Before the fire could penetrate the solid hardwood core of the front door, a sharp mechanical click resonated from beneath the architectural roofline. The structural eaves suddenly split open, revealing a series of hidden heavy-duty commercial-grade fire suppression nozzles. The network of advanced chemical sensors had instantly cataloged the extreme thermal spike. High-pressure pumps hidden beneath the foundation activated with an immense, deep thrum. A dense, chemical-infused fire-retardant foam exploded from the concealed nozzles, completely blanketing the porch in a white, suffocating sheet. The high-pressure water deluge blasted the flames from the wooden pillars, suffocating the oxygen and crushing the inferno instantly. Within moments, the towering wall of fire was utterly choked out, leaving behind nothing but a boiling cloud of white steam and the bitter scent of neutralized carbon. The dense cloud of chemical steam rolled slowly across the lawn, gathering in the damp midnight air. Blake's manic laughter died instantly in his throat, replaced by a cold, paralyzing disbelief. He stared at the blanket of thick white foam completely covering the porch where his magnificent inferno had been burning just seconds before. The system had operated with absolute non-negotiable efficiency, neutralizing the entire threat before the structure suffered a single inch of permanent structural damage. The heavy brass latch of the front door clicked sharply in the silence. The reinforced fire-resistant hardwood door swung inward without a single creak. I stepped out onto the foam-covered threshold. I stood perfectly straight, my tailored charcoal suit completely dry, pristine, and unbothered by the wet chaos surrounding the exterior. I held an advanced industrial control pad in my left hand, the green status indicator confirming the total containment of the arson attempt. I did not look like a vulnerable, defenseless grandfather sleeping in an old suburban house. I looked exactly like the architect of his complete and total ruin. I stood in the doorway staring down at Blake through the thin curtain of evaporating steam. My gaze was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of any surprise. I had personally overseen the installation of this commercial-grade infrastructure the exact day Blake began threatening my daughter's financial independence. I looked at his mud-stained clothing, his burned hands, and his broken posture, letting the silent gravity of the moment wash over his fractured psyche. He had brought fire to my home entirely unaware that the Vanguard network had converted the entire property into an automated trap. Before Blake could gather his scattered senses or turn to flee back toward the stolen utility truck, the silent neighborhood was instantly split apart by a massive wave of flashing emergency lights. 6 local police cruisers and 2 unmarked federal vehicles swerved aggressively onto the block from both ends of the street, completely cutting off any potential exit path. Their tires screeched violently against the wet asphalt as they mounted the curb, their high-intensity searchlights pinning Blake squarely in the center of the front lawn. The automated residential fire system had not merely deployed the chemical suppression nozzles. It had simultaneously transmitted an instantaneous, high-priority distress beacon directly to the emergency dispatch matrix, complete with real-time video surveillance of the arson attempt. A dozen armed officers breached the perimeter with their weapons drawn, ordering the suspect to drop to the ground. Blake panicked, spinning wildly toward the dark tree line, but his boots slipped on the wet grass. 2 muscular officers tackled him violently into the saturated mud, pinning his arms behind his back and slamming his face into the wet earth. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, permanently cementing his fate. The local police sergeant stepped forward, formally charging Blake with first-degree arson, grand theft auto, and attempted murder. He was hauled out of the mud, his face smeared with black soot and wet dirt, his broken posture a testament to his absolute defeat. I stood quietly on the dry threshold, watching the officers slide the cornered beast into the back of a waiting transport vehicle. Blake's chaotic, desperate run had officially reached its definitive, inescapable end. Blake sat handcuffed to the heavy steel table inside the sterile, windowless interrogation room of the municipal police precinct. Despite the dried mud flaking off his ruined designer suit and the aggressive smell of raw gasoline clinging to his skin, his narcissistic delusions remained fully intact. 2 seasoned detectives sat across from him, their expressions carved from stone-sliding photographs of the arson scene across the scratched metal surface. Blake leaned back in his metal chair and laughed with forced theatrical bravado. He entirely dismissed the photographs, loudly declaring that the entire situation was an elaborate illegal entrapment scheme. He looked the lead detective dead in the eye and aggressively spun a fabricated narrative of corporate espionage. He claimed that his father-in-law, a wealthy and vindictive black man, had maliciously orchestrated this entire nightmare to illegally seize control of Blake's highly lucrative tech empire. Blake shamelessly insisted that Eldon had used his vast underground resources and tactical contractors to plant the gasoline, steal his offshore assets, and physically drag him to the property against his will. He demanded that the detectives immediately release him and arrest Eldon for kidnapping, grand larceny, and corporate sabotage. He spoke with the absolute unwavering arrogance of a man who believed his elite status and racial privilege made him inherently untouchable by the local justice system. He continuously tapped his handcuffed wrists against the table, demanding his immediate release and threatening to sue the entire police department for civil rights violations. The detectives did not interrupt his frantic, venomous monologue. They simply let him talk, allowing him to dig his own legal grave with every arrogant, fabricated claim he spewed into the recording microphone hanging above their heads. On the other side of the 2-way mirror, Jonathan stood quietly in the dimly lit observation room. He wore his immaculate tailored suit, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Blake's pathetic performance with total clinical detachment. Beside him stood the district attorney, a veteran prosecutor who had built a career dismantling arrogant corporate criminals. The district attorney shook his head in disbelief, quietly noting that Blake's absolute detachment from reality would make the impending prosecution effortlessly simple. Jonathan did not smile. He simply nodded and tapped the glass, signaling the detectives inside the interrogation room to proceed to the next phase of their coordinated strategy. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room clicked open. A uniformed technician rolled a large commercial-grade television monitor into the sterile space, positioning it directly across from Blake's chair. The lead detective stood up, retrieved a digital remote from his pocket, and informed Blake that the department had recently acquired some highly compelling visual evidence. Blake scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes and muttering that any footage they possessed was completely fabricated or digitally altered by Eldon's expensive security team. He maintained his smug, defiant posture, fully convinced that his web of lies would hold up against whatever amateur surveillance video they planned to show him. Jonathan stood perfectly still in the observation room, watching the sheer arrogance radiate from Blake's bruised face. The district attorney crossed his arms and instructed the lead detective through his hidden earpiece to begin the presentation. The detective pressed the execution button on the remote, bringing the large screen to life. The room plunged into a tense, heavy silence as the high-definition playback initiated, completely destroying the remaining foundation of Blake's manufactured innocence. The bright television screen illuminated the dark interrogation room with crystal-clear 4K resolution footage. The initial video displayed Blake's sleek, unmarked sedan pulling into the alleyway behind Eldon's downtown holding firm 3 months prior. The camera angle shifted perfectly to capture Blake aggressively prying open the rear service door with a heavy steel crowbar. He watched his own high-definition face grimace with exertion as he broke the lock. The footage then cut seamlessly to the interior of the private office. The hidden infrared cameras recorded every single detail with devastating clarity. Blake watched himself rifle through Monique's private filing cabinets, extract the blank mortgage documents, and meticulously forge her signature under the glow of a small desk lamp. The absolute panic finally registered in Blake's eyes, his smug smirk vanishing instantly. But the presentation was not over. The screen flashed forward to the events of the previous night. The Vanguard Network's perimeter cameras had recorded Blake's stolen utility truck arriving at the suburban estate. Multiple overlapping angles captured him dragging the red gasoline containers across the manicured lawn. The audio feed was impeccable, picking up his ragged, manic breathing and his vile, muttered curses directed at my family. The final clip showed a tight, zoomed-in shot of Blake lighting the wooden match and tossing it directly into the saturated puddle of fuel. The roaring wall of fire illuminated his crazed, unhinged expression perfectly before the suppression foam deployed. The evidence was entirely airtight, sequentially linked, and absolutely irrefutable. It systematically dismantled every single lie he had just fed the detectives. Blake sat completely paralyzed, his mouth dry and his hands trembling violently against the steel table. The visual proof of his absolute destruction played on a continuous, inescapable loop. The heavy steel door clicked open once more, allowing Blake's exhausted, court-appointed public defender to step into the interrogation room. The attorney took one look at the undeniable high-definition footage looping on the television monitor and let out a long, defeated sigh. He walked over to the metal table, snapped his battered briefcase shut, and looked down at his client with absolute professional pity. He flatly informed Blake that his legal situation was completely beyond salvation. The public defender advised him in a hushed, urgent tone that going to trial against a mountain of concrete federal and state evidence would result in a maximum prison sentence. He strongly urged Blake to immediately accept a full plea deal, confess to the arson and financial fraud, and beg the district attorney for any possible leniency. The brutal reality of a multi-decade prison sentence finally pierced Blake's thick armor of narcissism. However, instead of surrendering, his cornered desperation mutated into a feral, volatile rage. He violently slammed his handcuffed fists onto the metal table, rejecting the lawyer's practical advice with a sharp, guttural shout. He completely refused to admit defeat or accept a plea arrangement that would permanently strip away his elite identity. He believed he could still negotiate his way out of the abyss if he could just bypass the legal machinery. Blake looked wildly between the two silent detectives and the one-way mirror, knowing instinctively who was standing on the other side. He practically leaped from his chair, restrained only by the heavy metal chain locking him to the table. He screamed into the empty space, demanding an immediate face-to-face meeting with Eldon. He swore he had information that could destroy the Vanguard Trust, entirely establishing a final desperate standoff. The heavy steel doors of the county detention center echoed with a hollow metallic clang as I stepped into the visitor's block. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a dull, relentless hum, casting a sickly pale glow over the sterile cinder block walls. I took a seat in the hard plastic chair inside the designated observation booth, my posture relaxed and entirely unbothered by the grim surroundings. A heavy security door on the opposite side of the reinforced bulletproof glass slid open with a mechanical grind. Two broad-shouldered correctional officers escorted Blake into the partitioned holding area. The transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant tech executive, who had once strutted through five-star restaurants in bespoke Italian tailoring, was entirely gone. He shuffled forward in a shapeless faded orange county jumpsuit, the bright fabric hanging loosely from his newly gaunt frame. His manicured hair was matted and greasy, his posture hunched, and his face shadowed by days of unwashed stubble. The dark, arrogant spark that used to define his eyes had been completely extinguished, replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. The officers forced him into the metal chair bolted to the concrete floor and stepped back, their expressions completely indifferent to his misery. Blake picked up the black plastic receiver mounted to the wall with a violently trembling hand. I slowly lifted my own receiver, letting the absolute silence stretch between us. He looked through the thick smudged glass, his eyes darting frantically across my face, searching for a single drop of the vulnerability he had exploited for 5 long years. He found absolutely nothing but cold clinical judgment. He was no longer a wealthy predator. He was simply a cornered inmate, completely stripped of his empire, his ego, and his freedom. The moment our connection engaged, the last fragile remnants of Blake's manufactured pride completely disintegrated. He did not attempt to negotiate or weave another elaborate web of corporate lies. He simply collapsed. He slid off the bolted metal chair and dropped heavily onto his knees against the cold concrete floor. He pressed his bruised, tear-stained face directly against the reinforced glass, sobbing with a raw, unfiltered agony that reverberated through the plastic receiver. He wept uncontrollably, his voice cracking as he begged for mercy. He pleaded with me to command the Vanguard legal team to instantly withdraw the mountain of civil litigation suffocating his future. He frantically promised that if I just spoke to the district attorney and secured a minimum leniency deal, he would vanish from our lives entirely. He swore on his life that he would forfeit all remaining marital claims, dissolve his bankrupt tech company, and permanently relocate to another continent. He whimpered that the county jail was completely destroying his mind, that he could not survive a multi-decade sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He clasped his trembling hands together in a pathetic posture of prayer, pressing them to the glass directly in front of my face. The sheer desperation radiating from his broken figure was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the man who had mercilessly terrorized my daughter just weeks prior. He choked on his own tears, offering to sign any document, confess to any crime, and surrender his very identity if I would just pull him back from the absolute brink of total legal annihilation. He begged me to remember the man Monique had once loved, desperately hoping to weaponize my fatherly compassion one final time. I remained perfectly still in my chair, watching his pathetic display of manufactured remorse without a single ounce of empathy. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not pity him. I leaned forward, resting my elbows comfortably on the narrow counter, and pulled the receiver slightly closer to my mouth. I kept my voice entirely level, stripping away all emotion until only cold, undeniable truth remained. I reminded Blake that true character is revealed when a man believes he holds absolute power over the vulnerable. I transported his fractured mind back to that lavish, humiliating dinner party at his luxury estate. I vividly recounted the exact moment he had intentionally dropped his silver fork onto the polished hardwood floor, looked me directly in the eye, and commanded me to lick my dinner off the floor like a starving animal. I watched his face contort as the inescapable reality of his own cruelty crashed down upon him. I told him clearly that his current suffering was not a tragedy, but a highly precise, meticulously calculated consequence of his own arrogance. I stated that respect and mercy cannot be bought with crocodile tears or frantic last-minute apologies delivered from the floor of a county jail cell. The Vanguard Trust did not operate on forgiveness. It operated on absolute accountability. I informed him that the district attorney possessed an airtight, completely irrefutable mountain of high-definition evidence, and I fully intended to watch the state prosecute him to the maximum extent of federal law. He had chosen to play a predatory game of power and domination, completely convinced he was the smartest man in the room. I simply reminded him that he had lost the game the exact moment he decided to target my family. Without waiting for another pathetic, stammering excuse, I placed the black plastic receiver gently back onto its metal hook. The audio feed cut off instantly, completely silencing Blake's frantic, whimpering pleas. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit, and offered him one final clinical look of absolute dismissal. The realization that his ultimate performance had failed completely struck him like a physical blow. The sudden crushing weight of a permanent federal prison sentence snapped his fragile sanity entirely. Blake scrambled up from his knees, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He slammed his handcuffed fists violently against the thick, bulletproof glass, screaming soundlessly through the soundproof barrier. His mouth opened in a wide, feral roar, his eyes bulging as he struck the reinforced window repeatedly, totally ignoring the pain radiating through his bleeding knuckles. The two correctional officers stationed in the holding room immediately sprang into action. They charged forward, grabbing Blake by his shoulders and violently wrestling him away from the partition. He thrashed and kicked like a rabid-cornered animal, fighting against the guards with a terrifying, mindless desperation. They drove a heavy knee into his back, subdued him completely, and dragged him backward out of the visitation booth. His feet scraped against the concrete floor as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room back into sterile silence. I turned my back on the empty glass and walked calmly out of the detention center, stepping back into the bright, crisp afternoon air. The psychological warfare was officially over. The steel trap was perfectly sealed, and the official trial date was firmly set on the federal docket for next month. The federal courthouse buzzed with a tense, suffocating energy. Every polished oak bench in the gallery was packed with journalists, corporate spectators, and curious onlookers eager to witness the final destruction of a fallen executive. Blake sat slumped at the heavy mahogany defense table, a hollow shell of the arrogant predator who had once terrorized his family. He wore an ill-fitting standard-issue gray suit, his posture completely broken, his eyes fixed blankly on the scuffed wooden floorboards. He did not possess the energy or the delusion to feign confidence anymore. The lead federal prosecutor approached the podium, exuding absolute, effortless authority. He did not need to employ theatrical courtroom tactics or raise his voice to secure a conviction. He simply laid out the airtight chronology of Blake's staggering crimes. The prosecutor methodically detailed the systematic financial abuse, outlining exactly how Blake had callously embezzled millions from his wife's private accounts to fund a lavish, illicit offshore lifestyle. He projected the high-definition security footage of the forged mortgage documents onto the large courtroom monitors, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. The prosecutor then pivoted seamlessly to the horrifying events of the attempted arson. He described Blake as a cowardly, cornered beast who, upon realizing his financial manipulation had failed, resorted to extreme physical violence. He presented the charred red gasoline containers and the chemical suppression logs, painting a vivid, undeniable picture of a man willing to burn down his father-in-law's historic estate out of sheer vindictive spite. The mountain of irrefutable digital, financial, and physical evidence completely suffocated the defense. Blake's exhausted public defender sat silently, offering absolutely no objections. The state had built an impenetrable fortress of truth, and Blake was entirely trapped inside it, waiting for the final mechanism of justice to crush him. The jury required less than 45 minutes of deliberation to reach a unanimous conclusion. When the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box, their expressions were uniformly grim and resolute. The foreman stood up, holding the folded verdict sheet with a steady hand, and delivered the inevitable outcome. Guilty on all charges of grand larceny, first-degree arson, corporate fraud, and attempted murder. Blake did not flinch or gasp when the words echoed through the cavernous room. He remained perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the crushing reality of his absolute defeat. The presiding federal judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward over the elevated wooden bench, his eyes locking onto Blake with intense, unfiltered disgust. The judge did not hold back. He delivered a scathing, merciless lecture that stripped away the final remnants of Blake's corporate ego. He stated clearly that in his decades serving the justice system, he had rarely encountered an individual so entirely consumed by toxic greed and unearned entitlement. He condemned Blake's cowardly attempts to manipulate the legal system and his horrific willingness to physically destroy the people who had offered him trust and shelter. The judge emphasized that Blake had treated his marriage, his business partners, and his own moral compass as disposable resources to fuel his endless narcissistic hunger. He dismantled the pathetic victim narrative Blake had tried to construct, labeling him a highly dangerous, calculating predator who possessed absolutely no capacity for genuine remorse or rehabilitation. The stinging reprimand echoed off the marble walls, cementing Blake's legacy not as a brilliant tech entrepreneur, but as a pathetic, manipulative criminal. He was forced to sit in complete silence and absorb the total destruction of his identity before the eyes of the entire city. The courtroom fell into a heavy, absolute silence as the judge gathered his final sentencing documents. He looked down at Blake with cold, unwavering authority, holding the heavy wooden gavel suspended in the air. He pronounced the final, inescapable judgment, ensuring the punishment fit the staggering magnitude of the crimes committed. Blake was officially sentenced to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly mandated that the sentence must be served in its entirety, entirely stripping away any possibility of early parole, good behavior reductions, or legal appeals. The sharp, deafening crack of the gavel striking the sound block signaled the absolute termination of Blake's life as a free man. Two heavily armored United States Marshals immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom. They grabbed Blake by his shoulders and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He offered absolutely no resistance. The Marshals clamped thick steel cuffs around his wrists, attaching the heavy chains securely to a thick leather belt fastened around his waist. The metallic clinking of the heavy restraints echoed loudly, a sharp physical manifestation of his new reality. He was abruptly turned away from the defense table and marched toward the reinforced holding door at the back of the courtroom. As he shuffled away, stripped of all dignity and power, he did not turn back to look at the gallery or the people he had tried to destroy. He simply stared blankly at the sterile tile floor, marching slowly into a dark, unforgiving abyss of concrete and steel. The heavy security door slammed shut behind him with a resonant mechanical thud, permanently sealing him away from society and permanently severing his toxic tether to my family. I sat quietly in the front row of the spectator gallery, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit projecting the calm, unshakable foundation of the Vanguard Trust. Monique sat directly beside me, her posture upright and her expression finally softening after months of relentless psychological warfare. As the heavy door closed behind Blake, she reached out and grasped my hand. Her fingers gripped mine tightly, anchoring herself to the unwavering strength I had provided since the very beginning of this nightmare. I squeezed her hand in return, offering a silent, steady promise that no one would ever be allowed to terrorize her again. Slowly, genuinely, a single tear escaped the corner of her eye and rolled down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or lingering grief for the man she had married. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated relief. The heavy, suffocating shadow that had darkened her existence for 5 years was finally and permanently lifted. We stood up together in absolute synchronization, ignoring the murmurs and flashing cameras of the gathered press corps. The tactical contractors waiting by the aisle parted smoothly to secure our exit. We walked down the center of the courtroom with slow, measured steps, leaving the dark, tense atmosphere of the legal proceedings entirely behind us. We pushed through the heavy oak double doors of the courthouse lobby and stepped out onto the wide marble portico. The crisp, brilliant morning sunlight washed over us, bright and incredibly warm against our faces. Monique took a deep, clear breath of the fresh city air, her eyes shining with renewed purpose and absolute independence. We walked down the concrete steps together, our family legacy secured, our enemies vanquished, and our future completely, undeniably free. 6 months passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary closed on Blake. The corporate empire he had violently tried to steal underwent a massive systemic purification. I immediately removed every sycophantic board member and corrupt executive Blake had installed during his tenure. Under the Vanguard Trust's absolute authority, I appointed a completely new, highly vetted management team grounded in strict ethical oversight and ruthless operational efficiency. The newly appointed chief executive officer, a brilliant visionary who actually understood the technology rather than just its stock value, streamlined the product pipeline flawlessly. Without Blake's constant embezzlement and toxic narcissism bleeding the accounts dry, the company's profit margins absolutely skyrocketed. The offshore accounts were liquidated and repatriated, funneling millions of dollars in clean legal revenue directly back into the domestic economy. I did not keep a single cent of this recovered capital for my personal use. Instead, I established a comprehensive, heavily endowed initiative named the Vanguard Scholarship Fund. I specifically designed this financial vehicle to empower brilliant, underprivileged African American youth across the entire country, providing them with full academic rides, mentorship programs, and guaranteed career placement in the tech industry. I wanted to ensure that the wealth Blake had maliciously tried to hoard would be utilized to build up the exact communities he had so arrogantly looked down upon. Watching the first round of brilliant young scholars receive their endowment letters brought a profound, unshakable satisfaction to my heart. The company was no longer a corrupt playground for a manipulative predator. It had become a powerful engine for genuine generational uplift, permanently erasing Blake's dark legacy and replacing it with a foundation of undeniable excellence and enduring integrity. Monique's personal transformation over these 6 months was nothing short of extraordinary. The hollow, terrified woman who had cowered in the dim light of a suburban safe house completely vanished. She reclaimed her maiden name and shed the heavy, suffocating anxiety Blake had weaponized against her. She began holding her head high, her posture radiating the undeniable strength and resilience she had inherited from her mother. Instead of retreating from the corporate world that had almost destroyed her, Monique chose to confront it head-on. She officially stepped into the inner circle of the Vanguard Trust, demanding to learn the intricate legal and financial mechanics of our family empire. Jonathan welcomed her with profound respect, serving as her personal mentor and legal guide. I watched with immense pride as she spent countless hours in our downtown holding firm, poring over dense financial ledgers, complex trust covenants, and international tax laws. She absorbed the information with a razor-sharp intellect, quickly mastering the aggressive defensive strategies required to shield our wealth from future predators. She no longer viewed the family fortune as a burden or a vulnerability, but as a powerful sword and an impenetrable shield. Monique sat confidently at the head of boardroom tables, negotiating asset acquisitions and auditing investment portfolios with a cold, analytical precision that left veteran executives completely silent. She recognized that true power required eternal vigilance, and she embraced that responsibility with absolute, unwavering resolve. The psychological chains of her past were entirely shattered. She was no longer a naive target waiting to be exploited. She had forged herself into the ultimate protector of the Vanguard legacy, ensuring that absolutely no one would ever attempt to manipulate our family again. With the sprawling corporate empire firmly secured and Monique's future entirely protected, I finally allowed myself to step back from the front lines of the battlefield. I drove my modest, unassuming sedan away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district and navigated the quiet, winding roads back to my suburban neighborhood. The evening air was crisp and completely still. I pulled into my driveway, the tires crunching softly against the familiar gravel. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked at the front of my house. The heavy, fire-resistant hardwood door and the surrounding wooden pillars had been flawlessly repaired. The Vanguard construction contractors had completely erased every single trace of Blake's manic arson attempt. The porch looked exactly as it had for decades, solid, welcoming, and entirely untouched by the violent greed that had briefly threatened it. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the quiet hallway. The house was perfectly silent, empty of any tension or looming threat. I walked into the kitchen, the familiar scent of old wood and polished leather welcoming me home. I methodically measured out a fresh scoop of dark roast coffee beans, placing them into the filter with practiced, deliberate movements. I stood by the counter, listening to the rhythmic, comforting drip of the brewing machine. The simple, mundane task felt incredibly grounding after months of orchestrating high-stakes corporate warfare. I poured the steaming black coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and walked slowly into the softly lit living room. I sank deeply into my worn leather armchair, feeling the familiar contours support my tired shoulders. I held the warm ceramic mug in both hands, letting the rich, bitter aroma of the black coffee fill my senses. I looked across the quiet living room, my eyes settling directly on the silver-framed photograph of Nadine resting on the mantelpiece. Her beautiful, vibrant smile remained frozen in time, capturing the profound grace and endless wisdom she had brought into my life. I stared at her image, offering a silent, solemn vow that I had kept my promise. I had protected our daughter. I had safeguarded the empire we built together from the shadows. There was absolutely no noise left in my house. There was no manufactured drama, no suffocating psychological manipulation, and absolutely no toxic greed polluting our family. Blake's arrogant screams were locked away behind impenetrable walls of federal concrete, completely irrelevant to our existence. I had not defended my family through chaotic shouting matches or violent outbursts. I had utilized the precise, calculating discipline of a man who understood the true nature of power. I had allowed the predator to exhaust himself, patiently gathering the undeniable evidence required to completely obliterate his life. I had used absolute, uncompromising financial authority to rebuild the natural order and sever the parasitic tether that had drained my daughter's spirit. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a tranquil, undeniable peace. Our legacy remained invisible to the greedy, yet unbreakable against any assault. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the quiet ticking of the hallway clock. The long, exhausting war was permanently finished. The silent adjustment was entirely complete. True power does not require loud declarations, chaotic arguments, or visible displays of wealth. Real strength lies in absolute patience, quiet observation, and the meticulous enforcement of strict personal boundaries. When predators attempt to exploit your kindness, never compromise your dignity by lowering yourself to their level. Instead, calmly gather your resources, protect your peace, and allow their own arrogance to orchestrate their ultimate downfall. You owe nothing to those who view your love as a weakness to be manipulated. Reclaiming your independence is the greatest victory. A life lived with unapologetic integrity is the ultimate form of lasting justice. If you enjoyed this story of justice and reclaiming boundaries, please leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more incredible life stories. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own strength and worth.